Yesterday, you probably saw Dr. Shipley. She'll be joining us again this morning. For those that didn't, I'll give you a little bit of her background. She's a licensed psychologist in Texas, Iowa, and North Carolina. She previously served right here as director of psychology at North Texas State Hospital, and currently has a forensic psychology private practice. She's published numerous articles in the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology regarding psychopathy and its clinical implications. So please join me in welcoming back Dr. Shipley.
Thank you, Chad. Good morning. I have actually a question/housekeeping question of my own. If folks do have questions, do we have mics out in the audience? Yes, okay. I want folks to know, because what we're talking about today, a lot of y'all have probably had some type of experience working, whether it's in inpatient hospital settings or in correctional environments. So if you have any thoughts, any questions, any examples, near misses, I'd love to hear them, and I'll make sure I pause adequately for you to get a mic. So I know it's kind of difficult with everybody spread out, but don't hesitate, and we'll try to get to you as quickly as possible. And related to that, I know that a great number of you are working in hospital settings. Is there anybody in attendance that works in another setting besides inpatient hospital? Yes. Are you outpatient or correctional? Outpatient. Okay, very good. Anybody else? Probation, parole? Yes. Oh, very good. Okay, excellent. So, oh, you're an attorney. Okay. You're right in the thick of it, of the whole process. So, absolutely. Anybody else? Any other kind of setting or position? Yes. Okay, excellent. In which county? Oh, Dallas County. And he probably said that, but my hearing isn't the greatest. Okay, very good. Excellent. Anybody else? I think we had somebody up here. Some of the language I use I just want to clarify based on who we have out here. Yes.
I work in a state-supported living center.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
I work in a state-supported living center.
Okay, great. Okay, very good. So a variety of settings. Anybody else? A lot of the literature related to boundaries in forensic practice, we probably get the best set of literature from correctional settings. The language will switch back and forth. A lot of times it will say patients, thinking primarily of forensic patients, but it could be interchangeable, and some of them I changed from correctional data or literature or examples. So either, these things pertain. There's some overlap from my presentation yesterday in that folks that are more likely to be successful or to attempt to manipulate hospital workers or attorneys or parole probation, all of the above, are more likely to have, at minimum, antisocial personality disorder, psychopathic traits, maybe full-blown psychopaths. Certainly you don't have to be a psychopath to want to manipulate or try strategies to get things that you need in environments where you can't freely access all the things that you want, the privileges or contraband. So just please know that, again, there are many folks that have become quite adept at working folks to make sure their needs are met, and they definitely are not all psychopaths. Again, you see the damage and the destruction and the prevalence even higher with those with psychopathic traits. So I'll give a few examples of that. But then I'm also going to talk about specific manipulation strategies, things to look out for. There's a lot of great examples from Dr. Salter, her work in correctional environments, great quotes that I'm going to interweave. But again, do not hesitate if you have a question or an example or anything of that nature. And I have my Red Bull this morning, folks, so hopefully I don't throw the mic. Okay, so we're going to talk about art of manipulation, ploys, how to avoid being set up. And again, anyone that thinks that you could not at some point or another be fooled or have a misstep, and this includes people that specialize in offenders that are more likely to do this kind of thing. It's always possible, but we want to look out and try to avoid it as much as we can. So when you're in an environment where folks are either already convicted of crimes or they're alleged to have committed crimes, anywhere through the system, you have to be aware, not just of what you say, but what you do, what's around you, your surroundings, your nonverbals, and how your actions might be interpreted. There might be things that you wouldn't imagine in a million years would be indicative of, hey, exploit me, or hey, I'm an easy mark for whether it's bringing contraband or allowing extra privileges. And the ask never starts out that big. It's a very slow, essentially a grooming process. Flattery will get you everywhere, so I hope y'all are taking notes on that. Also in Dr. Hare's book, he says, people can be induced to swallow anything provided it is sufficiently seasoned with praise. Certainly, in my years working here at North Texas, one thing that was always, it never ceased to amaze me when we would have patients come into treatment team. Some of the things that they knew about staff members or about goings-on, and they might be quite gleeful in telling you who's fighting with who or what's happening. Whether folks are in a hospital setting, a jail, or, excuse me, I don't know about y'all, but allergies are killing me. Okay, excuse me. I think that can had a hole in it. They have nothing but time to observe, to hear, and to profit from what you are saying and doing, not only directly to them, but probably even more frequently to your colleagues. So the person, your assistant, or whoever is there in there with you. Or let's say you're going into a jail or an environment and you have an intern or an associate and you're bantering about what have you before the actual start of the interview. Folks that are particularly primed to be manipulative or to be resourceful, because in the environments, some of these criminogenic environments that folks who commit a lot of crime come from, that's how you survive, it's how you profit, it's how you gain respect. So, you know, whether we're mental health professionals or not, and maybe we think that we're quite adept at quote-unquote profiling or kind of knowing who's in front of us, subtle nonverbal cues, sort of slippage in speech that gives you some clues about people's thoughts or intent. There are some folks that have no formal training that I'll tell you what could take about any one of us to task. Again, especially when you start getting into folks that maybe have a bit higher intelligence or are more psychopathic. But there's a lot of folks with a ton of street smarts just waiting to see, to listen, to hear, to see if there's anything at all, a little nugget they could maybe, you know, put in their pocket and use later on that we may not even realize we're giving up. Reflecting back a bit on yesterday. So most of us, we accept the rules and the terms of human interactions. We like to ideally think that most people are generally good, but there's always going to be people that are going to use their charm, their wit, their flattery, to try to convince you to do something that you would have never planned to do, not something that you wanted to do. Breaking it down even into our day-to-day life. How many of y'all have ever manipulated somebody? If you're not raising your hands, you're a liar. We all have. Mom, Dad, could I have the car? I'm going to go stay with Jenny, but I'm really going to see my boyfriend. Hey, you look great. You know, have you lost weight? Oh, by the way, I mean, you name it. It's part of human nature, and it's social learning. Social learning. We reinforce things. We try to influence one another all the time for different things. Now, hopefully, it's not the more destructive end of things, but one way or the other. Sometimes we lie. Sometimes they're white lies. Our intentions are good. And I realize that manipulation has a lot of very negative connotations, but really that's what it is, big or small. When we're trying to influence, encourage, or otherwise convince somebody to do something or in a direction because there's something we need or want. So anybody working anywhere within the criminal justice system, anywhere it intersects mental health, sometimes even if it's not a forensic system, and it is a state psychiatric facility that's not necessarily forensic, and you have a patient that really wants to be discharged. You're going to see it more frequently in a forensic setting. But it is so important to know yourself. One of the other things that I do that's a nice change of pace from doing criminal forensic evaluations, which is my passion, but I also do screenings for law enforcement, correctional officers, police officers. And in any setting or environment, one of the best tools you can have to be mindful of your decisions, what's motivating your behaviors, what might be a vulnerability that you may have, is to know yourself. When I was going through my training, you know, it was explained to us, certainly knowing that we're specializing in forensic populations, you're going to be seeing some of the worst that humans can offer at times. So again, and bringing it back to the law enforcement screenings, one of the things that I always ask is, what do you anticipate will be a more difficult either type of person or challenging type of alleged offense individual that you might be asked to work? I say a little bit more eloquently when I'm reading it off the paper or sitting at my desk. And part of that is, it's not to imply that you can't be professional and work with any population, but it's so very important that you are mindful that this one might hit me hard, or this is an area that I might struggle with. What do you guys think the number one answer I get when I say, let's just narrow it down to what type of offense, whether it's an officer arriving on a scene, or it's a jailer that's obviously working in a jail, and there's lots of inmates with lots of alleged offenses. What do you think is a group of charges do you think is the number one answer I get? Yeah, anything to do with kids. Sexual assault of children, molestation, child murder, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, of course, there's follow-up questions. It doesn't mean that you cannot be professional and quite effective in your role, but there's also a number of other questions. I won't go through them all, but things that kind of get an idea. Do you know yourself? Do you know your own stuff? Somebody that's not willing to acknowledge they've ever had disappointments or failures, or things that will be more difficult for them in a certain position or role, that gets a little bit more dicey. So again, we all have our own insecurities based on how we were raised. We have the areas where we feel most comfortable. We have areas where we feel the most vulnerable. So again, do your best to know yourself and be aware that you're giving up subtle clues all the time, especially if you're working in an inpatient environment, whether it's psychiatric nursing assistants or other nursing staff or people that are there hours and hours. A forensic psychologist might come in and spend 2, 4, 6 hours, depending on the evaluation, or other folks, treatment team folks. There's some of us that maybe would only see for a limited amount of time, but there's folks that are every minute of every day, are spending so much time, and we're giving off clues all the time, especially if we're not aware of our own stuff. All right, so I kind of belabored this, but I'm going to read this specifically. If you have weak spots in your psychological makeup, a psychopath is sure to find and exploit them, leaving you hurt and bewildered. So there's a few slides here at the beginning where I'm sort of addressing the worst of the worst, even though a lot of Dr. Salter's examples, I think, probably reflect more antisocial or psychopathic folks in a correctional environment. But there's a few things I want to highlight here at the very beginning. All right, so this is a quote from somebody that's psychopathic. When I'm on the job, the first thing I do is size you up. I look for an angle, an edge, figure out what you need and give it to you. Then it's payback time. With interest, I tighten the screws. And I'll break that down in more practical terms here in a bit. Another psychopath stated he never stalked attractive women. He could smell insecurity and loneliness the way a pig smells truffles. I think sometimes, and believe me, it's not just women. There's, unfortunately, numerous men and women of all different stripes, all different professional backgrounds, everything from correctional officers to psychologists or psychiatrists, and so on, that have been walked out, walk of shame, out of prison settings at best, sometimes things involving criminal charges and so on. Some of these folks are very good at what they do, and the con or the flattery or all of that time that you're being groomed, you may be very likely being spoken about in these kind of terms behind your back. But folks that are more susceptible, you want to believe that fantasy. Some personal need is being met. And, as much as in whatever setting we're working, you want to treat folks with dignity and respect, but within a certain ethical boundary and framework. It's absolutely critical for the good of them and their treatment or confinement, and certainly for the good of you and your career, livelihood, and so on. So, a psychopathic killer serving 3 life sentences in Canada for murder and sexual assault convinced prison staff that he should receive a day parole. I don't even know how that works, and I don't know what year that was. I noticed that it's Canada, and there are some wonderful, fine folks, but I'm pretty sure Texas probably would not give a day pass for somebody convicted of murder. But the point still stands. This gentleman, I say that loosely, escaped custody. He killed 2 people before he was returned to custody. So hopefully, missteps we make, things we might say, we hope something like this would never happen, but you always have to be on guard and aware of worst case scenario. Something that has always blown my mind in a just sort of head-slapping way. I always, before I start kind of giving you details, y'all know who this fellow is, right? Yeah, he's a charmer. I'm being sarcastic, of course, but Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He actually, I believe, was born in El Paso. This is not a Texas son that we're particularly thrilled to claim, but he took himself eventually to California. In the end, he was, hopefully this is correct, he was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, I think something like 11 sexual assaults, burglaries. He was particularly brutal. Also, he loved really baiting the media. He claimed to be a Satanist. He would scowl, make faces. Of course, the famous pentagram shot, I think that's coming up in the next. I think I did another picture of him. If not, I'm sure y'all have seen it. So when you see those pictures of him in trial or scowling and knowing what he did, what kind of reactions do you have? You're going to scream them out. Do you think, wow, I got to have some of that? Or are you like, no, this fella needs to never, ever get out. And it's interesting, but boy, he's not worried about what happens in court, which I think they had him dead to rights anyway. I also have to ask, I always like to bring in popular culture. How many of y'all watched American Horror Story? I think it was 1984. Yes. Of course, it's fiction, but boy, that actor did a good job, I thought, of sort of capturing the essence of Richard Ramirez. Kind of gave you the creeps, feeling like to be in a situation where you're one-on-one with that type of predator. I cannot even imagine. So that being said, this is not a unique phenomenon, but he, received hundreds, maybe thousands of fan letters. Women would show up in court. Same with Ted Bundy. And there's a whole other presentation about that kind of issue. But let me read you. I'm not sure if it's the same woman that married him, but there's a book written about Richard Ramirez. The author described, I know that word co-ed is kind of dated, but basically a female college student sat through all the pretrial hearings. Again, so she's seeing this. She's hearing about what he did. She sent love letters and photos of herself to Ramirez. She was quoted, I believe she was interviewed by this author, or maybe she said it into media, but this is what she said. I feel such compassion for him. When I look at him, I see a real handsome guy who messed up his life because he never had anyone to guide him. Wow. Wow. So again, this probably isn't a terrible person, but there's certain traits or vulnerabilities. There's a whole lot of psychology that goes into women or men that tend to be attracted to these types of folks and why. But again, these are extreme examples of people being drawn to. One of my classmates from graduate school was working at San Quentin post-graduation, and one of the jobs that she had was to do mental status exams on death row inmates. It wasn't just her responsibility, and I can't remember the frequency in which they had to do it, but it was fairly frequent. I think most of y'all are mental health professionals, but that's how's your mood, any thoughts of harming yourself, anybody else, any voices, things like that. And she described, in her interactions with him in that capacity, of course, prior to him dying, and I don't think she's been there for a very long time, but he would flirt and be charming, and he's in a death row cell for years, and he's still on his game. It's always probably, what can I get? What can I do? And I believe he passed away of natural causes a few years back. So, like I mentioned, this is not exclusively the realm of naive or lonely women. Again, there are many men that have also fallen into this trap in whatever setting. I know some of these are pretty dated, but do y'all recognize her? I know I've got her name up there. Okay, so Laurencia Bambinic, the media called her Bambi. She was an ex-police officer, and in 1981, she killed her husband's ex-wife. They had her dead to rights. She goes to trial, and I want to make sure I get this part right. That's it. So she gets convicted like a year later. She goes to a prison in Wisconsin. The mechanism, I believe, if some of y'all know the case better than me, don't be shy. I think it involved a male correctional officer that assisted her in some form or fashion. I can't give you the details. But she escaped from this facility, I think in 1990? Yeah. And she went to Ontario, Kansas, and she was out for a bit. Now, what's interesting is, again, she had numerous fan mail, a lot of male admirers, maybe some female admirers as well. There was one rally that they had in support of her where they all had signs saying, "Run, Bambi, run." And again, she was a former, I didn't mention this, a former Playboy playmate. She was very attractive, and again, she was also an ex-police officer. So she looked beautiful and very captivating and charismatic. Again, there's certain folks that might be a little bit more at risk. When they did recapture her, she eventually had I can't remember the issue for appeal, but she was allowed to have a new trial. And during that whole process, they dropped it to second-degree murder, and she pled no contest. She got time served plus probation or something of that nature. So it's kind of a head-scratcher. Yeah, so by 92. So within 10 years of all of this, and part of that time she was out of prison, she already was out. And I think she died in 2010 in natural causes. Any woman or man who has low self-esteem, strong feelings of dependency, and a lack of personal identity are going to be at higher risk. Psychopaths in particular are going to have little difficulty making quick use of folks that they identify as being more vulnerable or weak. Also, it's amazing, that last statement. Despite the numerous times and the numerous risks that they face because of these relationships, they feel compelled to keep hanging on to the relationship or keeping on to that fantasy, that piece that their life was missing, that bit of excitement, that I found my purpose. You know, I thought I was in a nowhere marriage or a nowhere job, and I feel alive again. So that feeling of being alive, that is definitely that fly in the web of if you have a more manipulative, charismatic type of offender. That new life that you think you're going to get isn't so great when everyone knows what you've done. Maybe you, in extreme examples, assisted an escape, somebody else gets hurt, now you're in prison, probably for the rest of your life. This person abandons you or quickly, it never turns out well when these types of relationships happen. Please don't yell out any names, but just by show of hands, how many of y'all, in whatever setting, are aware of someone that has been fired, reprimanded, what have you, for an inappropriate relationship with offender, patient, inmate? Anybody? Yeah, I'd say that's about 70%, give or take. Absolutely. And no one ever thinks it's going to be them. There are people that are certainly going to be at higher risk. All right. So Dr. Salter has given these examples. And these are from the inmates talking about how they identify and begin to sort of groom vulnerable staff. Find out something personal you're not supposed to know. What's her birthday? What kind of car does she drive? I'm having a conversation with her, but I'm collecting information from her that may be useful to me at a later time. Again, what's the big deal? Maybe you're making conversation, you're being kind. It doesn't seem like this person's a bad, terrible person. So what does it hurt? They're being real friendly. She probably just thinks I'm being friendly, but I'm sizing her up. We're fattening them up for the kill. I can pretty much tell you which of the guards are drinking every night, which ones are smoking dope. People are who they are. They may put on some armor when they come through the door, but they can't not be who they are. Thinking of another example, when folks that I'm looking at for different law enforcement positions change jobs, or maybe they're going to the police academy, and asking questions and going through that process, and there's a lot of really good ones, but I've heard they know better also than anybody else who are the bad ones, talking about things that concern them, or whatever setting you're in. If you have a coworker, associate, you name it, that has wobbly boundaries or that does things, and by the way, the inappropriate, unethical behavior can go to either extreme. I'm talking a lot about the romantic or bring in contraband, and we'll continue to talk about some of that. But the other extreme is also quite problematic too. And again, it can be in any of these settings, but people that gravitate to positions where I'm in control of your day-to-day life. So just as much as you might have somebody that has wobbly boundaries that will give things or do things, you also might have people that want to instigate an altercation. Claim that, let's say an inmate has a razor came for them or what have you, so you spray them down with pepper spray when nothing of the sort happened other than maybe they made a smart-ass comment about whatever, about you or what have you. So again, we have an ethical responsibility when people's life and liberty are confined or are in the hands of other people. It's a delicate responsibility. Also, and actually this is true too of jails and prisons. Not everybody's made alike. Not all offenses are made alike. There are people that had the worst day, night behavior of their life. They would never do it again. They're not otherwise an antisocial personality, ASPD, or psychopathic. Maybe it's a drunk driving incident, a first one, and I mean, you just name it. I always screw up the quote, but there by the grace of God I go. This idea that, you know, not everyone that are in these settings are a predator or what have you. Now, specifically in a forensic hospital setting, it becomes, and I think the doctor yesterday afternoon made a good point of this as well. You have patients that have major mental illness that are quite vulnerable, or patients that maybe are IDD or have other extreme vulnerabilities. And when you do have people anywhere along that continuum that tend to be more exploitive, more violent, those people, not just staff, but those individuals are particularly vulnerable to exploitation from these types of folks. So we have an added responsibility to make sure that we're following the rules, keeping everybody safe. I also want to say, when we're doing presentations, for example, where I'm talking about psychopathy, it's a real scary combination, but there are times you will have someone that will have a very severe personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and maybe so on. But they also have a major mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. I remember when I was a graduate student years ago, because I'm old, and I was watching Dr. Malloy present, and he was talking about one of the most dangerous combinations of mental health diagnoses or personality disorder diagnoses was severe antisocial personality disorder and schizophrenia paranoid type. So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but most of y'all probably know that mental illness in general doesn't correlate strongly with violence. Now, there's specific symptoms, specific diagnoses that do, but as a whole population, they're more likely to hurt themselves or be exploited or harmed or be victims than actually hurt somebody else. Now, once you get into the realm of certain types of delusions, certain types of voices, if they involve violence, and definitely paranoia, then you start seeing the possibility for much higher risk of violence. If you have someone, let's use it for example, with schizophrenia, paranoid type, that has more kind of violent delusions, but this is also somebody who in the community demonstrates a lot of psychopathic traits or is very antisocial. In a hospital setting, when their major mental illness starts responding to antipsychotic medications or whatever the good psychiatrists are giving them to help with that, and that starts getting better, what do you think happens? Yes. Now the part of them that can be very organized and predatory is heightened to another extent. Now that's going to come out. And if you have folks that could sort of run the game, run the show in a prison environment, how do you think they're going to work things in a hospital setting? it gets real dicey. Thank goodness there is a huge difference between a forensic hospital and a prison for good reason. But when one of these individuals do end up in our system, then it can be quite problematic. With men, it's usually our age or younger. They talk too much. They tell us entirely too much information. They tell us what kind of bars they drink in. They might be talking to their buddy, too, about who they hooked up with, or other staff members. Again, this could be men or women. Now, let's say you're having a casual interaction with one of these people, and they say, hey, Leslie, me and your daughter, 2 years from now, me and her. And Dr. Salter gave the example that, okay, so you just don't answer, you ignore this, you walk away. And, the question being, well, what was that all about? It's fishing. He wants to know if I have a daughter. That's a way to get information. If I know that you're not going to directly answer certain personal questions, if I say something that I think might get your goat, then I can still consider that a information gathering process. Again, some of these techniques or strategies, when I'm doing a stress interview for a violence risk assessment, I'm not asking, how you feeling today? And what, I am asking those questions, but I'm pushing on the things that I know have been, whether it's a delusional system, whether it's things that trigger them or that they rail upon, because I want to know where they're at with those types of thoughts. So again, we all get a lot more off our game if we're mad or we're upset. So there's a lot of different ways to gather information. How about if you're seeing individuals in your office? Should you have lots of pictures of your kids and your pets and your significant other? Yeah, not a good idea. Again, I think whatever capacity you work in this field, a lot of us have become, you have to be able to compartmentalize. That's true of a lot of fields. There are things in my personal life that I would fall apart. I can't watch the ASPCA commercials, even cartoon depictions of animals I over-identify. I love animals. Yet, my area of expertise, one of my areas of expertise, are the most violent types of offenders. Psychopathy, sadism. But even if it's not that extreme, but I'm doing threat assessment or violence risk assessment, I've interviewed plenty of folks that have engaged in animal cruelty. And not only can I not get upset, I have to act like it's the most casual thing they're telling me about and ask them several follow-up questions as if it is the most natural thing. Same thing if they're talking about harming a child or deviant sexual fantasies or, I need to get that information. So we all have a way to sort of compartmentalize so we're good at our jobs. We all have a role to play, and getting all up in our feelings, it's not our job to punish people, and it's also not our job to rescue people in these settings. Another quote, in this system, they're not really afraid. They don't understand that they only go home because we let them, because we choose to let them go home. That anytime we wanted, we could hurt one of them real bad. I'm going to try to be just as general as possible because I don't want to give in a maximum security forensic hospital setting, I would interview some of the more complex risk assessment or people going up for DRB or things of that nature. And one of the things that I was a stickler about, I don't want to just see other hospital records where things might be, and we all do it, are regurgitated or here's their perspective on whatever. For the more serious capital cases or very violent or what have you, give me the original police reports. I want to see it. If they have correctional records, I want to see it. And there's one gentleman, and I'm going to not give much of his case information at all. I'm going to give some other information that, let's just say that it was a very, facing capital murder, and a lot of very scary things about the case. I'm saying that in a very non-professional way, but things that as somebody that's going to evaluate violence risk assessment are of great concern. Overkill, going across states, having other people's IDs, and women's IDs, where do they come from? I don't know. But also, This person was relatively handsome. It may not be my opinion, but there were definitely people that thought so. And if you did not know the details of the murders, and not only that, but other things that had led up that you would understand were pretty significant risk factors, you might have thought he was a staff member. And when I was still working here at the hospital, there were multiple times over the years that I would do, at change of shift, I would do sort of staff trainings, quick and dirty violence risk assessment. Without going into everything, we had to very reasonably choose certain information to let people know, frontline staff, this is who you're dealing with. Not to be mean or awful to this person, but to be aware, here are the risk factors. Also, most folks would be very responsive, grateful for the information, would ask good questions. There would always be a couple that would be glaring at me, like who am I and what do I think? Because I'm sure this person's persecuting me, or especially because I was the one that would present for a number of years him to the DRB, and it got to a point where even when I wasn't on the unit, but I was director of psychology, and there was a few times because of unique circumstances that I would go, and he would say, it's Dr. Shipley presenting me, I'm not going, which of course it's his right to go or not go. But there were folks that absolutely could not believe that he could have done anything violent. We also had a scenario, and this is many years ago, so I'm sure even now, there have been several people in this position since this. This was a long time ago. But we had two high-profile patients, this one gentleman that I'm talking about now, and a female. And we've had many, many. So there were things on the unit that as a treatment team we did because there was a lot of concerns about this combination. And I have sort of alluded, but there was a very odd, atypical delusional disorder, but otherwise organized with the gentleman, but a lot of psychopathic traits. So there were things that happened on unit, and to their credit, staff was very savvy. The folks that on the direct unit had been working with him. So the treatment team took steps to limit certain contacts. It was brought to our attention later that they were being allowed to work together, sometimes after normal kind of hours, at the chaplains. And again, to great credit, the psychiatrists, the treatment team, everybody was on the same page. Oh, no. We have to make clear that this is why we have these types of boundaries. It's for their safety, it's for other people's safety. And again, I'm just giving you limited information. But again, when the team met with the chaplain, it's shocking sometimes in these cases, people get very invested in who they think, who they've seen this person is. And again, I was the big, bad, mean psychologist that was just persecuting this fellow. But us communicating is very, very important. So security. Safety is always the first priority. Be aware of your personal items, documents. A lot of us will have case files. I already mentioned personal items like photographs or computer screensavers. You don't want to give that information away because of whatever interaction or whatever the person might have been accused of. Also be very aware of the documents that are in your files or on your table. Your computers. I know some of this is like, yeah, we know. We go through lots of trainings, we're aware. But I think those of us who've been in any kind of system for a long time have probably heard it all. And things that we take for granted that, well, of course people know not to do that. You'd be surprised. It'll rear its head from time to time. All right. Clothing. Also that seems obvious, but be very aware of what's on your t-shirt or how revealing your clothes are, or obviously I go into the jails a lot. I'm going to wear the shirt I'm wearing today, not the shirt I wore yesterday. Not that it's inappropriate for this environment, but I don't want to be doing this or have any possibility of feeling uncomfortable. It's just be mindful of your clothing. Also, in environments where there might be very young staff being hired that might be in the system and be fantastic lifelong employees, but some of that comes along with being young and just needing some guidance on how to be professional but also appropriate. So when there are inappropriate staff-patient, inmate, correctional officer, and so on relationships, there's damages not just to that individual, but to the system. So, for example, in the hospital, you're damaging the hospital's credibility. There's a credibility issue and violation of trust. And this, again, could apply whether there's excessive force type situations or an inappropriate sexual relationship. Any of those things can damage the public's trust and should. For you personally, there's personal hurt or embarrassment, disciplinary action, loss of your job, criminal prosecution, and financial loss. And we're going to talk too about how folks can get baited and groomed into those behaviors. Okay, we already talked about that. So when we're in staff positions, there's, obviously we have the authority, we're in quote unquote power and control, but folks that are very good at this, they're trying to shift that balance. And again, it's not going to be coming at you head on, give me this or do that. It's going to be, again, a more subtle process to make it more likely that they're going to be successful. Skip some of that we've talked about. Yeah, if you lose your credibility, it says as an authority figure, but it could be also as a professional, as an objective person for whatever your position is, that is a big problem and you're not going to be effective. You don't want to be too friendly and never foster a personal relationship with individuals in your care. Now, I want to be clear. That doesn't mean you can't be kind and treat people with dignity and respect, but just the flip of me saying that when you're talking to somebody psychopathic that can give you 2 lines of just about anything and they can't go any deeper, you can give pleasantries. If let's say they're going to the dangerousness review board and they're feeling anxious, it is perfectly therapeutic to be, hang in there, you'll do fine, or is there something you're concerned about, depending on what your role is. It doesn't mean you're a hard ass and you're cruel, not at all. It's maintaining absolutely good boundaries so you can continue to be effective. I might be jumping ahead here just a bit, but let me, I don't mean to sound like this is just rampant, but of course I'm going to bring up any examples that I have because of the nature of what we're talking about today. But we've probably all experienced, I'm going to use the hospital setting. Let's say you're a treatment team member, and whether it is some sort of behavioral restriction or something's happening, and you might have somebody, and I'm not picking on anybody, I just need an example. Let's say you have a nurse that comes in or that's particularly bonded and they think that something was unfair. The treatment team is being unfair. And you could give numerous examples. It could be the psychologist. It could be, but sometimes you will see it's kind of becomes obvious when somebody, and it could be for any reason. We talk about like countertransference, or it might be that the person reminds you of your sister or your dad or your mom or your brother or what have you. It doesn't mean it's a sexual thing. It could be I really feel for their story. I'm really moved by their history of abuse. Or it seems like they're really innocent of this charge and they're just being railroaded. So you can have very kind-hearted, good people that there needs to be a lot of understanding about the environment that you are in, because there is a very delicate balance of, again, being friendly, being within reason, friendly but not inappropriate, and treating folks with dignity and respect. When I'm interviewing all different types of offenders, we talked about superficially charming. It's kind of funny because as I'm saying this, I'm like, I kind of use that strategy. I can be, depending on who's in front of me, I can be like, ah, shucks, and kind of I tell them when I'm there. I have to tell them what, the forensic warning or whatever. But whatever I think is going to disarm them without giving them inappropriate information. But to try to get them talking, but I'm never going to give them anything that really matters. I might start BSing, did you see the game? Or, hey, I'm sorry we're having to meet under these circumstances. Here's what we need to do for the court. I know you've gone through this type of evaluation many times, so just thank you for being patient. Oh, shucks. And then before they know it, I'm asking the right questions, and they've given me a lot of information. So again, within boundaries, depending on what your position is, how much you should even be talking about certain things, but you can be friendly within boundaries to do your job. This comes up a few times. Whatever system you're in, whether it's your family, whether it's your job, there's certain things about human nature. People tend to click, and there's also certain people that don't like other people. It happens. Where it gets particularly tricky is when those, let's say in a work environment, when those things spill over. So it may not be that you are talking to the forensic patient. It could be that you're, on a shift for hours with somebody that you do like, and this other really shady person just didn't do what they were supposed to do, or left you, didn't do their job, or, it's everybody knows everybody, or, what have you, and then there's that whole exchange. These types of individuals can really target, if somebody's ostracized or they're kind of on their own, it's kind of the divide and conquer type strategy. If it's that kind of employee or type of person, doesn't mean they will, but it just means it's another risk factor that they may be more likely to be targeted as a vulnerable person for manipulation. The vulnerability, you can't just approach anyone because not everybody's going to fall for it. Not everybody is going to buy into what you have to say. They also talk about swinging and missing. Yeah, you're going to strike out a few times, but if you keep at it, you'll eventually get some of what you want. I've seen female staff with reputations for being a hard ass. Turned out she was one of the easiest to get to once you know. Sometimes she's stern and shitty, but you just know. Again, I think I started this point, I don't know if I brought it around, but there are some individuals that could probably run circles around our ability to profile certain individuals. They may have an honest desire to listen, to help. If you're somebody that finds it difficult to say no, and also the issue of taking command in a stressful situation. Okay, so once an individual is targeted, now they're going to start putting slow, steady pressure. The ultimate goal is sort of this stepwise kind of system to get them to do the thing that they're wanting. They will test to see, and this is a big one, small rule violations, things that you might rationalize, oh, that's not a big deal. Or I'm busy, yeah, just go take it. Or, if I just give them this thing that's not even a big deal, our shift tonight will go way easier. And I've heard this from correctional officers, and I've also heard this from hospital staff. When there's a coworker that does this type of thing, it's very frustrating because when you are setting the boundary and doing what you're supposed to do, it not only sets up a potentially even more exploitive situation for them, but it makes it more likely that you could be berated or attacked or whatever when you are setting the boundary. They may make sexual comments to staff to see how you react, how open you might be, what you will or will not allow in a conversation. They're things that make us uncomfortable. And sometimes it's a natural reaction to giggle. Again, you have to be very aware of what your reaction is and how it might be interpreted. I did also mention that particularly if you have young, straight out of high school folks. You've got some folks that are very emotionally mature, very savvy. There might be other folks, and this could be actually at any age, that are very naive to a criminal subculture. They're thinking about what is appropriate human interaction about things. If you ask, somebody's asking you for something and it's not a problem to go and get it for them, you need to know the rules, the policies, procedures. So, it says what makes people vulnerable. This kind of cracks me up because needing attention and praise, check, we all do sometimes. Feeling unappreciated, we all do sometimes. Feeling unattractive, we all do sometimes. It's how much is this an issue for you? How deep does that run? How much do you wear that kind of on your back for people to exploit? With females, they prey on women who don't normally get the kind of attention that they're not exposed to outside the institution. When she comes in, they treat her like a queen. They don't joke about her weight. They don't make her feel stupid. I meant to look up this situation, and I'm sure it's been fairly recent, but it's just a prime example. It was a civilian worker in the prison, I can't remember which state, but where the two men escaped, and she had been married, had children, and she had assisted in that. Does anybody remember the name of that? No, but you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, and I can't remember. It's like I have the fuzzy outlines. This is where I obsess. I want to look up every case so I can talk to you about it. But this one obviously jumps to mind as an extreme example. She was working, I believe, in their vocational program, somehow sewing things. I can't remember, but she interacted with these fellows in a work program. And again, she was at a stage in her life where she felt a lot of these things in spades and maybe had never been talked to or treated in the way. Again, it was BS. It wasn't real. It was a con. But how it affected her and how effective it was to her, it was significant, and it was catastrophic for her life. Their persistence can be unrelenting and overbearing. They were pestered long enough until staff give in just to get rid of them. Again, that can be a little thing. It can be something that's, there's the big things, but there's also kind of little things. And they'll just keep on and keep on. I've done a lot of social learning trainings in the past, and there's certain types of, again, social learning concepts that apply across so much because we are human beings and there are certain ways that we learn, and we're social creatures. One example when I do that type of training, so you're in the Walmart checkout line, and there's all kinds of candy on both sides, and you have a child, I want this, I want this, I want this, no, no, no. The child starts screaming, throwing a tantrum, no, 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 and so on and so on. And finally, the parent's like, God, just take it. When we get in the car, but take it. Quit embarrassing me, shut up. And in the moment, for that brief moment, you solve the problem. But did you make that problem more likely to occur in the future or less likely? Yeah, more likely. You just reinforce the behavior. So next time, doesn't mean you can't change and still get that behavior gone, but it's just going to make it more difficult. So let's say the next time you're in that grocery line or wherever you are, and now, so the child's pitching a fit, you're saying, no, the child might, I'm going to take it to a whole nother level because I know if I keep pushing, yelling, embarrassing you long enough, then I'll get what I want. So again, kind of a real life example on how things like that can work. It's also related to a concept when we're talking about intermittent reinforcement, and it can apply to this kind of situation as well. So the example for that is when you go up, I about said pop machine. I'm from the Missouri and Iowa, and I know it's a Coke, what kind here, and I've been here for years, but I just spent some time in Kansas City with family over the weekend, and so, boy, my pop just about came. It's a pop machine, Coke machine. Let's say you put in money. You want your Coke. Nothing comes out. You might jingle the thing, try to get your coins to release if you're really thirsty and this is your only option, Maybe you'll put in a few more coins or whatever to see if that'll kick it loose. But are you just going to keep doing that? Yeah. You expect, you put in the money every time, the product should come out. Kind of everybody with me there? Now let's say you're in Las Vegas and you're at a slot machine. How long do people sit there sometimes without winning a thing? Maybe because they won something 5 years ago. I mean, it's kind of an extreme example. But it's that idea that you don't expect a slot machine to pay out every time. But in addition to the buzz and the whistle and all the things that, get us going, it's for that chance, that possibility. If I keep going, it could be the next time. Well, now the machine's hot. So if I've been on it for a long time. So if I walk away and that next person sits down and they win, I'm never going to forgive myself. So again, we all have things with human nature about how we learn, what we believe, what we do. So that idea of intermittent reinforcement. I'm going to give you this privilege or this thing today, but now I'm going to tell you no. So again, if you have reinforced something once, you can change that pattern, but be aware you've now made it more difficult to extinguish or get rid of that behavior. Can didn't have a hole that time. All right. I've kind of covered that. I have less than an hour, so I'm going to get a move on. A lot of this we've covered. Okay, so this kind of addresses a different issue, but it's along the same lines. There's a perfect one right here, a boyfriend-girlfriend, where she has come in with black eyes, and he has been known to hit her on state property. Thank goodness, I know Mr. Smith would never let that, that happen. But in this situation, not only staff must have been talking about it because the inmates were aware. Where she has come in with black eyes, and he has been known to hit her on state property. If going to him every night at home, her husband or boyfriend, is a frightening experience, and coming into work every day to me and talking to me is a pleasant experience, that's my in. So again, targeting those, not realizing the danger that's right in front of you, feeling like this is somebody that'll listen, and the person's more vulnerable. As we mentioned earlier, these types of individuals may intimidate or coerce lower functioning patients, lower functioning inmates or defendants or what have you. So getting back to contraband. Eventually, something will let you know that he or she smokes weed. You start noticing them more. You start observing their actions. If you're a drug user, you tend to know the demeanor of a drug user, how they carry themselves. So also in these settings, there's a lot of folks that have very difficult jobs for very little money. So again, there are things that can be enticing in terms of bringing in contraband, and it might start small, bringing in food, something that seems like it's non-consequential until they've got the lever and you're on the hook. So there are some other examples we'll get to, but you can avoid being manipulated by adhering to following rules while you are on duty. Be suspicious, question, and verify every patient question or actions or request. Well, so-and-so, the nurse on whatever shift said that I'm supposed to have blah, blah, blah. Or the treatment team said that I'm allowed this privilege. Okay, verify. Be kind. All right, well, I'm just going to check that with the team. I'm going to go look at your medical record. And if that's the case, no problem, but I'll let you know. So again, verify. This goes for anything. Follow institutional rules, policies, and procedures, and know what you don't know. It is okay to say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. I don't know if we allow that. Is that, if there's even a flicker of a doubt, ask somebody. You are not being cruel or unkind to say no or to not address it in the moment. Monitor and document remarks, gestures, and actions. This is huge. If you have that type of interaction, document it. Just as I made comments that there might be things that a person does that they don't realize is a big deal. There might be things or a pattern that's developing with a certain patient or inmate, and without that kind of documentation, somebody that might be going through the record to make decisions about any number of things will need that information. There might be multiple people that have pieces of a puzzle. Document, document, document. Communicate openly and often with supervisors and other employees. Know your job, and again, get further education if you're not sure the right or correct answer. So you learn to say no, and when you say no to something, no means no now, no means no later, and no means no always about certain types of things. Get comfortable with whatever reaction you get to that. Sometimes I think we're socialized to not disappoint somebody, or to not be mean or a bitch or an asshole, or you name it, right? Because you might be called everything you can imagine, but just get real comfortable with no means no and why it's important. We already discussed this. Let me give you another example, because it keeps popping into my head, where again, this person had zero bad intent. But when I give you the example, tell me if it just kind of it strikes you where, yeah, that's probably not a good idea. There was a staff member, it's just easier for me to say a floor staff, just saying all the titles gets tricky, and they were braiding a patient's hair. So he was sitting in front of her, so just like if you're braiding your kid's hair, you kind of have to straddle behind them so you can do the thing. I don't think that person in any way intended for it to be anything sexual, but what are some things that are wrong with that behavior of a staff member towards a male forensic patient? What was that? Yeah, what was that? Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of things, right, that could go wrong. First off, there's a bunch of other patients watching this happen. You're physically doing a very intimate, intimate kind of thing. Somebody's touching your hair, and it's, again, the person was, this is years ago, but was a bit upset that, how dare we think that that's wrong? And it's a cultural thing. No, it's a cultural thing to go to the beauty shop, make an appointment, and that happens there with however the hair needs to be done. It is not the job of a staff member on unit on the floor to be doing that. And now you've got, and it's not just staff, you have other patients going like, WTF, like, okay, can we get in line for that? We didn't know that was an option. So again, be aware. Clearly this person didn't think it was a wrong behavior because they were doing it right out in the day room. Excuse me. Tell this is dated, hip. Some officers try to be so friendly and so hip. We're the kind of guys they read about on the news. We're the tough guys. Some of them come from these small communities. They try to be so nice, they call us by our first names. There are times that we will work with a high-profile patient, somebody that you might turn on, and it used to be Nancy Grace, but whoever it is now, where they are talking about the patient that maybe you're their attorney or you're their treatment team psychiatrist or evaluating psychologist, and there might be numerous people that are interested. Oh, are you working with that person? What's that like? And can we talk about that? No. Yeah, whatever capacity you're working, especially if they're somebody that's pre-trial and out in the community, in the jail, or they're in our setting, there are extreme cases where there might be media trying to contact you and see if you can give information. Conversely, you might also have, we talk about different personality styles with patients or inmates. There's a whole range of personality styles and motivations also for people that work in these settings. So you might have somebody that's very opportunistic and thinks, I want to bring in contraband and make some extra money. Or I want to call up and see if I can get somebody to pay me for XYZ information or a picture of somebody. So again, being aware of these kinds of issues and boundaries. Never give or take anything to or from a patient, no matter how trivial. I will admit that when a patient, somebody that was in a women's issues group, it was a maternal filicide type situation. Upon their discharge, gave me, or right before, gave me a brief thank you note. And that's something I took. But along the way, and in general, again, you have to be careful that that could be a lever or something that might make you fear that you might get in trouble. Take action early. I'm sure everyone's supervisors, if you think you did step in it, maybe even at the time you didn't realize, I guarantee you there's not a supervisor or a coworker that wouldn't much prefer you to say, oh my goodness, I didn't think about it, but this is what happened. I think I might have screwed up. I mean, there's some things that so cross the line, it's a whole other issue, but there's times that maybe you're at the beginning of that vulnerability, grooming, gaining a lever process, that not only will that not get you in more trouble, that might be greatly appreciated and could be a very important learning experience. We all grow and learn. We've all probably stepped in it in some form or fashion at one point in our career. Probably obvious, and I probably touched on it, but you also want to be careful that you never give one patient special privileges or power over another patient. And just as I said, these types of individuals are always watching, learning, whatever. You may have a whole lot of other patients, the majority of your patients, that are also watching and learning. And how demoralizing is that? You know, when you see somebody that's exploiting you, when staff isn't looking or they're doing X, Y, Z, you're seeing them get special privileges, and you're also, they're seeing that, and that has an impact. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples of power and control tactics. By no means is this all-inclusive. Testing. So a person's attempt to gather information about a staff's likes or dislikes, strengths or weaknesses, tendency towards leniency or gullibility. It's kind of like fishing in a way, where you're just throwing out different stuff and seeing what sticks, what might be a lever. Some information then might be filed away for future use. I won't give you every example, but there are some pretty good examples from some correctional training materials that a psychologist who had worked in state prison and federal prison for a number of years, there was a gentleman named Larry, who is a death row inmate, after he killed another cellmate at another institution. And in reading these examples, he is definitely psychopathic and very savvy and good at what he did. So I'm going to shorten this, but basically there was a special programs unit in a state prison, and they had a community meeting every Monday morning. There was a new, I don't know what position this person was in, an officer or staff member, and shows up, and I'm just going to read this part. Larry noticed that the officer had brought a nice-looking briefcase to work and asked the staff member if it was a Christmas present. When the officer answered in the affirmative, Larry asked if he could take a look at it. The officer replied, "Sure, why not," and handed the briefcase to Larry. Larry set the briefcase on the floor and proceeded to jump up and down on it. All of the inmates in attendance and even some of the staff erupted with laughter. Larry picked up the briefcase, returned it to the officer, and casually remarked, "I guess the commercial is true. A gorilla can jump on a Samsonite without damaging it." The unit officer, whose face was red as an apple, let's see here, quietly excused himself from the meeting while muttering obscenities under his breath. He was unable to live down the embarrassing experience for months. So again, that's not the end of the world, but that was definitely a testing situation. Deception, that's inherent in many of these. They're going to create a character, a person, information that they think you might want to hear. Diversion, this can be a really scary one in any of the settings we've talked about. where you have a group of patients or a group of inmates that create a distraction or disturbance over here, so another person or groups of persons can either get into a restricted area. Sometimes it's escape, assault. Maybe it's to divert attention over here so they can attack a peer. And sometimes it's to maybe attack the staff that was trying to enforce the boundary or follow the rules. These are the situations where escapes, assaults, sexual assaults, and other serious acts of misconduct can occur. This is one example I do want to read to you, but extortion is basically where you're going to threat, intimidate, I know something about you, or you're more vulnerable to me in some way, and I'm going to try to compel you to do something you don't want to do. I think this one's kind of a good kick in the gut if you're somebody that thinks bringing in little things isn't that big of a deal. While residing in a maximum security state prison, Larry established and maintained a reputation as a broker who could acquire virtually any item that any other inmate might desire. And this is mind-blowing. For example, he managed to secure marijuana, handcuff keys, and even a .22 caliber pistol and shells. That one, I have no idea how that happened, but apparently it did. Not surprisingly, he relied heavily on certain staff members to bring in as many of the illicit items he sought, as well as to provide personal services such as taking his mail to a local post office and affording him unrestricted access to a telephone. One staff member even brought in federal tax forms, which Larry used to file bogus, tax returns. He filed bogus returns, not just for himself, but for other inmates. And to guarantee that, and this is the part that individuals that might be going down this path should be aware of, to guarantee the cooperation and loyalty of these carefully chosen prison employees, Larry maintained detailed records of the dates, times, locations, and amounts paid or received for all services rendered by his agents. You know, I said document, document, document. That can go both ways. What kind of loyalty do you think Larry would have if this person gets busted? All right. He even paid for each staff member to use a long-distance calling card so he could further track his employees. And that calling card was issued to a telephone number on the outside, so it created another way to track his employees' activities. Consequently, no one who worked for Larry could afford to steal from him or fail to follow through with an assignment. To do so would result in losing their jobs or facing criminal prosecution. And that's the rub. Once you've sort of stepped into it, the deeper you get, the harder it is to get out. You know, they say reach for the moon, and if you don't make it, maybe you'll reach the stars. And by the way, I love my mom, but she always screws up sayings. So sometimes, even when I think I know it, Mom sometimes taught it to me wrong, so please don't judge me. Hopefully I got that right. You got the idea. So if whatever they're working the person for, if it doesn't result in a physical relationship, it may result in a TV, a pair of shoes, tapes. By the way, that's also pretty dated, but you get the idea. You get something from them. It's a con. So if you shoot for this, but you still get this, hey, that's a win. If there's no way I can manipulate you, or it's going to be too time-consuming, I'll move on. So you want to be one of those persons that they move on, that you're not the easy mark. A negotiation, offer to exchange information or something else of value to staff for some kind of accommodation or privilege desired by the patient. And certainly, this can apply in lots of capacities. I'm sure our attorneys in the room are aware that there might be certain things that maybe a jailhouse snitch or somebody else, the ask might be too great or inappropriate. This ostensible quid pro quo arrangement rarely turns out to be as beneficial for the staff as it is for the patient. Yeah, also this sort of mock, hey, I know you're new and this is scary, and maybe it's your first time on this ADSEG unit, administrative segregation. Look, I got you. You seem like a nice person. I'll tell you who you need to stay away from, and I'll also tell people to leave you alone. Again, there's usually an ulterior motive. Just an aside, I mentioned yesterday that while I was in graduate school, I worked about 1.5 years as part of a practicum placement at Valley State Prison for Women. And they did have the ADSEG shoe. And again, it's been years ago. And we would sometimes go in and do testing, but we'd have to wear a version of like a vest that I couldn't get shanked with, as long as they didn't go for the head. But they also would be chained. Please don't go for that. Anyway, but I want to tell you, and this is sort of a unofficial poll. I've been in men's prisons. I've been in jail, lots of jails. I have never been so sexually degraded or commented or harassed as when I walked through there. I mean, it didn't bother me. I kind of knew what I was facing. But some of the things, because it was sort of a tier situation, so when you're walking in to go to the room where you're going to be, where the person's going to come in so you can test them or follow up on whatever the issue is, and there's just, 3 or 4 tier of just, you're in a round. And some of the things, you might hear, oh, I like your outfit or whatever, and then you might hear some things I've never been, that even men haven't thought of to yell or scream at you. So that's pretty intense. Anyway, that's another example of don't react. You're going to make it worse if you do, certainly. Those folks are much better at that game than anything you could possibly say or do. Just ignore. Rumor clinic, spreading gossip. That's true with your coworkers, certainly if it's involving the folks you're working with. Revenge, I kind of mentioned this. Some of these things go hand in hand. So maybe there's a diversion tactic, so I can get revenge on somebody that maybe reported stuff I wasn't supposed to do. Or, and I'm not even sure what the current policy is, but if there's a staff member that makes me follow the rules, maybe I'm going to call in a complaint or make a point to call in complaints on certain people that even if they come out unfounded, hey, that takes them off the unit for a while. And that gets to be a very, very challenging situation because, of course, you want to make sure that the patient's rights are being protected and that nothing untoward has happened. But when you have somebody that is more antisocial along this continuum that is using that as a strategy to take that individual staff member off the board, it can be extremely disruptive and exceptionally inconvenient for that staff member. Same goes for if you're a mental health professional and they call in a complaint. You might be able to more than prove that didn't happen, but in the meantime, you might have some very uncomfortable, difficult weeks or months getting things squared away with your board. Ingratiation, some of these overlap, but that's the I'm going to do something nice to you for you, so there's a sense of reciprocity. There was one a couple examples ago of I'll tell you who you need to be careful around, or it could be for lots of reasons. If there is a patient that becomes aggressive with, let's say, nursing staff, and you're trying to get staff to make sure that she's okay and then the person is separated from him or her, and you might have certain patients that want to jump in. And sometimes it's with the best of intentions. They want to protect you, and you don't want them to get hurt. There's a reason why we don't want them involved in those scenarios. But you also might have some that might use various types of opportunities to ingratiate, so then you owe them one. Splitting. We all know what splitting is, right? This can happen with coworkers, with whoever, but pitting one against the other because you want to have leverage, and this always works best when people are not communicating. If you suspect this, or something doesn't feel quite right, or someone's telling you that so-and-so and whatever said this, communicate. The best defense of this kind of thing is communicate with all parties involved, hit it head on. Let me read you one more example that's not in a slide. And I think it's important to quickly mention because it has a more unique point than some of these other ones. Okay, so there's one tactic that's called solidarity. I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up. It refers to an organized attempt by an inmate or group of inmates to compel a staff to undertake a course of action considered favorable, or to abandon an initiative deemed unfavorable to the inmates, for example. So this is the part that's kind of important. It's often based on the inmate's geographic origin, ethnicity, religious affiliation, or gang membership. So again, just as a group of individuals that are stuck in an environment they don't want to be in 24/7 can tell if you're, if you smoke weed or if you're fighting with your boyfriend because they're picking up on things. They may also figure out who they might be able to target, whether it's they can tell that maybe you were affiliated at one point or time with a particular gang. Or maybe you have racial concerns that they've overheard you talking about. This is an angle that can be another hook for different types of individuals. That makes sense? Okay. Oh. Why is it just going back and forth between the same slides? Okay, there we go. See if I can get this thing to work now. I skipped some of those because we've already addressed it and we're getting close to time. But so again, remember that being vulnerable or even slipping up or having a misstep, it doesn't mean that you're unfit to work in forensic environments, to do what it is that you do. It just means that obviously you want to learn from it, you want to become more aware of your environment, and you may just need an alternative approach to be more successful, but also to not put yourself in those situations. On a lot of these slides, there's resources that I use. There was some great, again, there was such good stuff. I know that certainly a lot of correctional environments have very organized staff trainings pretty routinely, some more than others, but on these types of issues. So these questions come from one of those. So things to consider. It's your self-evaluation. Or if there's somebody that you're supervising, to be mindful. Am I overly friendly or familiar? Do I appear gullible? Do patients consider me too trusting? Am I excessively sympathetic? Is my demeanor timid? Is my enforcement of rules consistent? Or, on the flip of that, overly harsh? Do I handle compliments in a non-professional or embarrassing manner? Do I share personal problems with patients, inmates? Have I been known to forget to check the validity of the person's information and stories? Do I sometimes let issues slide that should be addressed immediately? I don't want to deal with that now. I don't want to do the paperwork, whatever. I'm going to ignore it or let it slide. Do I circumvent minor rules for my own convenience or in response to something that's being requested of me? Do I allow the taking of license or liberties? Can I be made to feel obligated? Am I easily distracted? Do I have difficulty with command, control, and saying no? By the way, just very quick point on the can I be made to feel obligated? I kind of hinted around it some yesterday, but quick plug, you've heard it from me before and you've heard it from other speakers, but it's easy read and it's very good information. But Gavin DeBecker, the book is A Gift of Fear. It's talking about sometimes when we're in the face of people that are inclined to be predators or situations where red flags should be going up, or you have that inner voice that says, I don't know, this doesn't feel right, or no, I should avoid that. Sometimes that's overridden by our socialization. Again, I hope I'm not offending with these words, but if you're working with these populations, I'm pretty sure y'all can take it. But as a woman, am I just being a bitch? Am I going to be, viewed in some way? Am I being let's say it's a person of a different race or culture, and it's something that you wouldn't let anybody do. Like, no, I don't need you to help me take my groceries up to my apartment. I don't need the help, thank you. Oh, but I don't want them to think I'm being rude or whatever. And this is true, men, women, whoever. Trust that gut. Trust that inner experience. And also, do not feel obligated because someone has expressed to you a kindness or offered you a kindness that somehow, you know, you're being awful to decline it. You can decline it kindly but firmly. All right. So again, you're going to decrease your likelihood of being targeted by these types of individuals if you are firm and clear and consistent with whoever you're working with. Never do anything to, for, or with a patient that you would be ashamed to share with your peers or supervisors. Keep everything out in the open. This will only ring a reference that only some of y'all will get, but fantastic supervisor I had for a number of years, Dr. Parsons, and I'm sure she's heard this from her supervisors. We've all probably heard it. Her classic line of, do not put anything in an email that you wouldn't want to see on the evening news or in Mr. Smith's inbox or what have you. So again, that just kind of reminds, that's sort of a good rule to live by in any professional context. If you suspect a request or an action of some type that could lead to manipulation, tell several peers what took place. Again, your silence allows that to breed, and it also gives that person further power over you. Let the person or patient know that you told. Make that really clear. Better yet, tell your peers or supervisor in front of the patient or inmate. Again, it's that idea of you're not going to split me. If you come at me with something like that, everyone's going to know, and I'm not going to make a unilateral decision that could get me in trouble. All right. If the person is sincere, he or she will appreciate the recognition and follow up for their request or problem. If he or she is thinking of manipulation, they will move on because setup practitioners do not want the openness that you have just expressed. We already covered that. I think we've more than covered that. All right. Any questions? I know there's so much on this topic. Does anybody have anything that they've experienced or any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question.
I can hear you,
here.
which is great. Oh, right there. Okay.
I work in the training department.
Yes.
And with manipulation, we've always heard stories from direct care staff, specifically from the PNAs.
Yes.
Constantly, it's always been anxiety, stress that some of them have seen or struggled through. Other staff fall into it.
Yes.
And sorry. And with today's shortages due to COVID, my question is, what do you advise supervisors, like how to handle to decide whether or not remediation or termination is required for the staff who has fallen under possible manipulation?
It's a great question, and let me say this, and I heard most of it. My hearing's trash even when I'm not in this situation, but there's going to be a whole lot of depends. There's some things that are going to be very clear by policy, by law, and you would consult with your supervisor and go through that chain of command to do what you're supposed to do. I think that it's always hard when there's things that are gray. It might be something where you do a detailed counseling note. And I would always recommend, if you're not sure, please consult with your supervisor. Sometimes you have a good person and a good employee that made a bad decision, but it's not irreparable. It's not something that they couldn't benefit from training, especially if they brought it to you. Obviously, if it's other people bringing it to you, but every situation has to be examined on a case-by-case basis. I'm thinking of a sports reference, but when you have certain, I think it's colleges or whatever, that violate certain rules, and there's some that get the death penalty or whatever, and so every situation, and by the way, obviously I'm not referring to that for staff members, but the idea that every situation is going to have unique circumstances. If there is the possibility for counseling or follow-up, you'll know it, especially if you're consulting with supervisors. There's other things that, unfortunately, if that's been done, there has to be action, or it might have to be reported, depending on what it is, in interaction with the patient under their care. I know that's kind of general. Did that somewhat answer your question?
Yeah, and just have a follow-up question.
Sure,
So
yeah, you bet.
what kind of words would you give to supervisors who struggle with the thought of, well, we are currently short, and I really do not want to terminate this individual because, well, for safety, because we are understaffed? What kind of words would you offer them if they're in that thought process?
Thank you for reminding me, too, about the understaffed issue, because I do want to validate. I cannot even imagine what y'all are going through. I had several good years working here, and I know it's a hard job, even when you're as fully staffed as you can be. So that is a miserable, tough situation. Again, just like when we're talking about, in this case, like a patient, staff, your supervisee situation, the supervisor also can't fall into that same trap, right? So again, let's say that whatever this person has done is something that your supervisor or administration would be very concerned about, and it would require reporting, or it would require, you would need their support to give you guidance on whether to keep a person on. I find that most things come out in the open. So even if there's that desire of, oh God, I know that they didn't mean this and I don't want to deal with it, if it then comes out that you didn't follow up appropriately, now you're in the exact same position, right? Another famous supervisor quote of, I'm sure, all stripes is, the cover-up's worse than the crime. You don't want to, even if it's with good intentions, cover up something that needed some follow-up. And it could very well be that the follow-up doesn't require firing or taking somebody off unit, but you are putting yourself in an incredibly vulnerable position to to take that gamble or to move the bar on what's acceptable because of staffing issues. And I know that's not a perfect answer, but does that make sense?
No, it's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet, absolutely. Yay, y'all are asking questions. That makes me happy. Yes? I can hear you pretty well, but go ahead and give her the mic, because I want to make sure everybody, because this is a good point. And the light's blurring in my eyes, but I think I know you.
Huh?
I think I might know you.
I'm Terry.
Hi, Terry.
I just wanted to caution that all of these things that you're teaching are so appropriate to life in general, but they're also very appropriate to working situations outside of a forensic conference, outside of any kind of forensic work, and that is in nursing homes. As a social worker, I have found in different areas, nothing I can talk about, of course, but you find this kind of manipulation ongoing in people that are in their 50s and 60s and 70s that still have this ability to con information out of you, and they're not maybe as dangerous as the people here.
Right.
Hopefully not, but it's a caution, and I just want to thank you for bringing all this up, because it is very, very, very applicable to life and to other work situations.
Well, I want to tell you, I really, really appreciate you saying that, but it is so true. I think many of these concepts or ideas do apply to any setting. It can apply to your family. It can apply, and there's a number of strategies and things, and anytime there's multiple people, there's going to be a dynamic, and there's going to be folks that are more vulnerable. You might have folks that are more inclined to manipulate or turn people against each other. Just being aware that these kinds of things happen, but thank you for bringing that up. I know I was trying to be mindful of the different kinds of populations, but you're right, it can be any number of different populations. Thank you very much. Anybody else? We got somebody back here.
Dr. Shipley, since you worked out here, I know you're probably familiar with HTHT or Pi 2.0, where staff are in training that when somebody is upset, try to identify something that might help them calm down. And first we go through their safety plan, but then maybe offer them a snack. When at the same time, they're told follow the diet absolutely, and we don't give food rewards outside of individualized treatment plans or individualized contingency plans or the prescribed diet. How do staff navigate that dichotomy without getting put into a position where they are then being either factually or perceived as being willing to break the small rules so that they can be pulled into breaking the bigger ones?
That's a good question, and I want to make sure that I got the general. And by the way, is this adult population or adolescent? You might have said that. So. Yeah, it could be either. And I'm gonna do this as carefully as I can, because what you are asking is a theme that runs through when you're having to do a specialized plan, behavioral plan, or when we try to individualize treatment. Or if we know a person might have certain triggers for aggression or violence or whatever. And, you want staff to be creative within the rules and limits, and so there might be certain specific things that you do. And I don't know that I know the right answer, but we were talking about social learning. Part of what's exceptionally tricky in those environments is you might have a person or a patient doing everything they're supposed to do, and yet you're seeing somebody that's doing everything they're not supposed to do get that extra reward or that extra snack. And, well, I want that. And you mentioned another thing that certainly is more in the scope of the doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, but it obviously, anytime you're creating a plan like that, and with food and so on, you absolutely have to consider dietary needs and make sure that that's clear and communicated to everyone. Speaking of family real quick, those of you who have sisters or brothers, I don't think it's an uncommon thing that perhaps the sibling that's more of a problem tends to get more of the attention or more of the whatever, where maybe you're the hero child and you're putting your head down and doing what you need to do, and there can be, even in totally different circumstances, that can create resentment or frustration. I might resemble that remark, I'm just saying. But in terms of food as a reward, I actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to punt a little bit. Does anybody else working on programs or in a situation where you are identifying things to help reduce agitation or aggression, anybody have any thoughts about that? I think we have a gentleman over here if you've got a mic. Hang on a second. My hearing's so bad, and I want to make sure they hear your question. Anybody got or your comment? Do we got a mic? Yeah, right here, this middle row, or in the middle there. Keep coming down. There you go. And thanks for giving me the assist, because these situations always have so many landmines if you don't know all the details. So go ahead.
Sure, I do behavior plans at Terrell.
Good.
Were you asking specifically for questions for me, or were you wanting questions?
Yeah, do you have any thoughts working in that? And you can ask me a question too if you'd like. First, do you have any comments about the idea of perhaps a patient that's acting out, getting an extra treat or snack as part of a safety plan? My lingo might be wrong, but as part of a safety plan to de-escalate, and perhaps how other patients might react to that? I'm just putting you on the spot, don't mind me.
No, that makes total sense. Sometimes that can be good, but sometimes it can be bad also, because it sets up the staff to have to do that every time. This goes back to like at the candy store when they're at the store,
yeah,
and they expect it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It does depend on the situation, so sometimes you want to give them what they need to prevent them to getting to that point. I think it's better to look at the antecedents and the precursors. So if you start noticing that
speaking my language,
somebody is acting out, so at Mahia, when I worked there a few years ago, I had a patient that would start pacing back and forth in this one specific area. Mm-hmm. And I knew that if he started saying his father's name or certain things like that in that aspect, that it was time for him to go do his work. And if he didn't go and do his work and get his money so he could buy his drink and get his snack, then we were going to have an issue. So
Right.
you got to follow the steps at the beginning and get to the successive approximations to shape that behavior.
I like my, behavioral. Let me add something too. I don't know if you wanted to ask another question, but that did make me think of something. When you're talking about issues of primary without nerding out too much for those of y'all that want to go to sleep with all of our psychology behavioral talk, but it has really practical implications. When you're talking about the difference between primary reinforcers, for example, food, or secondary reinforcers, money, one example where you can go and buy food, right? Or delay, there's a delay versus immediate. You're getting immediately reinforced for something versus I can use this to later get something I want. There are factors relating to somebody's intellectual functioning, somebody's ability to focus and learn. So for certain individuals, you might have to do a plan that has more of that because that's really the only thing they might respond to initially, and just like you said, successive approximations, but that you hope to maybe spread apart those rewards or eventually change the type of rewards. Now, that's a more complex, like a more nuanced behavioral plan situation. You have to be careful if it's let's just give him this so he'll quit, pitching a fit. And also maybe a thing to consider is, again, if all of this is appropriate with the diet and it's really based on a solid plan, not just a plan of convenience, if there's any consideration to where maybe that snack is given so it isn't in full patient view. Now, how that individual person will react and what they'll expect is a different thing, but that also maybe helps a little with the whole, social learning and people observing and modeling. I want rewarded, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm talking quickly, so get y'all out of here. But I so love these questions. Anybody else? Questions or comments? I mean, no matter what, when you're doing a plan like that, don't make it a plan of convenience because you might be making it harder on yourself later on. And you better be considering all the factors and thinking several steps ahead about what are the potential implications. So the way you're thinking is very good that you got to consider all those things. Did you have follow up? Okay, I'm sorry. I must have misunderstood. By the way, thank you for speaking up because I don't want to not answer your question. So I love that. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
I see like a divergence in the way that we train them to maintain healthy boundaries and assist them in maintaining healthy boundaries and not looking like an easy mark, and training that we also receive as nurses and PNAs, and I don't know why I haven't had to go to it as a prescriber yet, but that this is one of the avenues that you can pursue if somebody is acutely acting out and does not have an individual contingency plan or a behavior plan to deal with this behavior. One of the things is to identify if they might be hungry and offer them a snack of what is available.
Gotcha. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I took that a whole nother direction.
Yeah, it's all good.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, and that's related but not exactly the same thing. And I so appreciated the doctor yesterday mentioning this, although she might have meant it. Sometimes psychologists or nurse practitioners or whoever might do a detailed plan, and you may very well provide it or even discuss it, explain it, and then if it's not enacted or used or considered, or if you're not thinking about other ways that the options need to be considered, that can be a very frustrating, time-consuming issue. Thank you. Anybody else? Anyone? Bueller? All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Good morning. Hope everyone's having a great week this week. My name is Kayla Steinley. I'm the Director of Pharmacy here at North Texas State Hospital. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speakers. They are presenting a presentation called Emergency and As-Needed Medication Use in Psychiatry, and their names are Dr. Kristen Neumeister and Dr. Emily Selby. Dr. Neumeister is originally from St. Louis, Missouri. She attended and graduated from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa with her Doctor of Pharmacy in May of 2014. She then completed 2 years of postgraduate residency to specialize in psychiatric pharmacy. She completed her PGY-1 residency in general pharmacy at the VA St. Louis Healthcare System John Cochran Division in 2015 with a focus in ambulatory care. She later completed her PGY-2 residency in psychiatry at the Minneapolis VA Healthcare System in 2016, after which she obtained her board certification in psychiatric pharmacy. She has worked at JPS Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas as a board-certified mental health clinical pharmacist on their inpatient psychiatric unit for the past 5 years. She is an active member in the College of Psychiatric and Neurologic Pharmacist Recertification Editorial Board, which is involved in creating continuing education activities for Psychiatric Pharmacist Board certification. She is a preceptor for pharmacy students and psychiatric residents and lectures for JPS PGY 1 through 4 psychiatric residents. Her professional interests include substance use disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and geriatric psychiatry. In her free time, she enjoys traveling and trying out new restaurants. Dr. Emily Selby was born in and raised in Denton, Texas. She attended and graduated from Southwestern Oklahoma State University in Weatherford, Oklahoma with her Doctor of Pharmacy as well as her MBA in 2016. Following graduation, she completed 2 years of postgraduate residency to specialize in psychiatric pharmacy and obtained her board certification in psychiatric pharmacy. She completed her PGY-1 residency in clinical pharmacy at the JPS Health Network in 2017. Next, she finished her PGY-2 residency in psychiatric pharmacy at Parkland Health and Hospital System in 2018. She then practiced as a clinical psychiatric pharmacist at JPS Health Network before joining the Janssen Neuroscience team as a medical science liaison. She is currently practicing in her hometown of Denton, Texas at Community Pharmacy, a progressive independent family-owned pharmacy where she has led COVID testing and vaccination efforts among other clinical programs. Her professional interests include mental health, pharmacy leadership, and precepting pharmacy students and residents. So they are both incredibly distinguished and professional pharmacists for sure. So without further ado, please help me welcome our next presenters, Dr. Kristen Neumeister and Dr. Emily Selby.
Hello? Okay. Good morning. I will start by thanking everyone for being here. I can tell that y'all are already awake. I heard you with the giveaways. So if you fall asleep, I'm not going to take offense to that. It is before lunch, but I trust that you are fully caffeinated and ready to go this morning. Thank you, Kayla, for the kind introduction. As she mentioned, we are going to be talking about medication management of psychiatric emergencies this morning. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. She said we're very distinguished. We're not that distinguished. We don't have anything to disclose, no financial relationships, or anything of that nature. In terms of objectives, there are a few things that we'd like to cover this morning. The first is that we want to talk, and I'll start by talking about some of the techniques that we can utilize to help decrease the use of emergency medications for psychiatric emergencies. I think pharmacists kind of get stereotyped as being individuals who are the first to push medicines, whereas actually I think Kristen and I would both agree that that's not necessarily the case. We're really looking to be good stewards of our medicines. So I'd like to present some alternative techniques that we might use to decrease the need for medicine, as well as before we get into what medicines we want to use. We'll discuss some of the pharmacokinetic properties commonly used for psychiatric emergencies, so evaluating time of onset, absorption, and comparing some of the different formulations that we have available. We'll review the evidence regarding the efficacy of agents utilized for psychiatric emergencies. So we all have our favorite go-to combinations that we'll utilize commonly in these instances, but are those really evidence-based? And so Kristen will spend some time reviewing that. We'll, of course, review the safety concerns and potential side effects associated with these medications, with the hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll feel very comfortable or more comfortable developing a treatment plan for these patients and utilize these medications appropriately. So we have a very extensive abbreviation list for you here. Hopefully this is printed in your handouts and can be a guide as we go throughout the presentation. Okay, so why are we here really, aside from the fact that I know this is a relevant topic for all of us? It's estimated that there are nearly 2 million episodes of agitation occurring in the US each year. And the incidence of workplace violence is nearly 4 times higher in the healthcare setting as opposed to other industries. I'm not even working in the psychiatric setting right now, and I still experience workplace violence, right? COVID shots and COVID testing, I get a lot of elbows and hand swats with plenty of my patients. So I know you encounter the same things in the settings that you're working in. I don't hear a lot about workplace violence from any of my friends who are accountants. And in fact, the emergency department alone is very vulnerable for this particular thing. Over 50% of emergency room nurses endorse experiencing either physical and or verbal aggression from agitated patients. When we look at psychiatry specifically, I think these estimates might be a little bit low, but it's estimated that agitated behaviors occur in up to 10% of emergency psychiatric interventions, with the prevalence being about 11 to 13% in patients who carry a diagnosis of schizophrenia or a mood disorder. It's no surprise that these rates increase when we introduce substances as well. So we're looking at nearly a quarter to a third of patients who carry a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder or substance misuse. So we've thrown around the term agitation quite a bit already in my presentation, but it's kind of hard to find a set-in-stone definition. This is one definition that I found that I really liked. So agitation can be defined as an extreme form of arousal associated with an increased verbal or motor activities. These are generally going to be repetitive activities and non-goal directed, right? So you might have even caught me off to the side here, kind of wringing my hands or wringing my wrists prior to the presentations. So we like to think of agitation as existing on a spectrum, from anxious, somebody like myself prior to presenting, all the way up to aggressive. So I want to kind of get you to start thinking in your mind of agitation as not just the violent patient, but as also the patient who might be anxious that can progress from anxiety to agitation to aggression. Because if we can identify these patients early, there's the hope that we could identify, assess, and intervene before we progress to aggression. So with this in mind, there are a lot of validated scales out there that you may be familiar with. I've included some of those here, but those can all be really helpful tools to help identify and assess agitation early. One in particular that I've worked with in the past and will highlight here today is the Behavioral Activity Rating Scale. So this exists on a continuum from 1 to 7, with 1 being difficult or unable to arouse. So certainly kind of down and out for the count, with 7 being kind of what you might think of in the most stereotypical sense of agitation, right? Violent, very extreme. Our goal for our patients is going to be quiet and awake. So a normal level of activity. We may see some fluctuation between, 3 to 5, right? We can all kind of vary in those ways throughout our day naturally, right? I might be a 5 prior to presenting. I might be a 3 later on this evening feeling really tired. But our goal for our patients is going to be to have them at a normal level of activity so we can engage them and assess them appropriately, right? So since we are talking about agitation specifically, I'll take some time to kind of blow up the 5, 6, and 7 of these. So 5, not just a slightly excessive normal of activity, but maybe somebody who's pacing, restless, they are easily confused, and may appear distressed, but can be redirected, right? There's some bizarre behavior, but certainly not violent by any means. So we want to try and identify those patients early. I'm just going to keep beating that home so that we can intervene as appropriate. When we consider what a 6 might look like, we might start to notice some of those signs of aggression. So maybe tense muscles, clenched fists, but certainly not violent. They're going to maybe continuously pacing, very restless, may have some demands, maybe very repetitive, can be redirected, but is a little bit more challenging or needs to occur continuously. And then finally, when we consider what a 7 on the bar score might look like, this is going to be your most obvious sense of the case, right? So individuals who are striking other patients, striking staff, harming or repeatedly threatening individuals, not redirectable, kicking, biting, scratching. I'm sure we've all seen very creative forms of aggression that would fit into this category. So I'd like to introduce our patient case that we're going to kind of follow throughout our time this morning, and that is JT. JT is a very typical individual in the sense that he's probably somebody we've all seen in our practices before. He is a 38-year-old male. He's been brought to the hospital on a detention warrant for hitting a woman at the Social Security office and then running into traffic. It's suspected that he was recently kicked out after his group home after getting in a fight with one of the other members and has not been taking his medications. He endorses suicidal ideations with intent, and the police officer who brought him in noted he's been responding to internal stimuli. Upon arriving to the hospital, he believes there's cameras on the unit that have been planted by the Russian government, very suspicious. Has already kicked a staff member and is yelling racial slurs. So I've heard y'all are pretty interactive, and based on what I know about and have seen of y'all this morning, I'd love to ask if somebody could share what they might consider the bar score to be. 7, I heard it. I didn't even have to wait that long. I love it. Yeah, so 7, not a trick question. It's pretty clear that this patient has already progressed and was really kind of already there by the time we were introduced to him at the hospital, right? So we will revisit JT shortly, but kind of returning back to some of our information. Previously, we didn't have a lot of guidance on how to treat agitated patients, so we kind of just went with restrain and sedate. And we thought, okay, that's fine. They can't harm anybody else when they're restrained and sedated, and it makes my life a lot easier. In 2012, however, one of the guidelines that we're going to spend some time covering this morning are those put forth by the Beta Work Group. And they've provided a lot of guidance to sort of break the notion of restrain and sedate, and provided us with some other options on how we might best manage these individuals. Because ultimately, we don't want to interfere with both the medical and the mental assessment of the patient that can get to the root cause. The medications that we choose and the way we choose to interact with these patients does directly impact the length of stay for these patients, and that is something to consider. So what do we want to do if we don't want to restrain and sedate our patients? Well, I've included some goals of treatment here, but I would say that these are probably already pretty obvious to most of us, right? We want to make sure that there's no underlying medical conditions that we're missing. Is there a medical etiology that we should consider? We certainly want to stabilize the patient rapidly. and avoid coercion, hopefully working towards a therapeutic alliance that's going to set them up for the best disposition and care after discharge from the hospital. We want to treat them in the least restrictive setting, right? Because that's going to help formulate that therapeutic alliance that's going to be the goal of our treatment. So the beta work group has actually outlined some domains of de-escalation that can be really helpful to help decrease the need and use of medicines for psychiatric emergencies. So while we are pharmacists, we do want to consider what else we can utilize, again, to help kind of decrease those needs. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk through some of these domains of de-escalation. And I'm sure a lot of you probably already know. I would hope that a lot of you already know or try to incorporate these into your practice. But it takes kind of driving home the point this morning. So of course we want to respect personal space. This is going to be the safest thing for both you and is going to be the least threatening thing for your patient, right? So kind of giving them their space, especially if there's concern that the situation may continue to escalate or has already escalated in the case of JT. We don't want to be provocative with our language, but also with our body language. So we want to consider how we're approaching the patient. Are our arms folded? Are our hands visible? Are our hands like clenched? And so all of those things can be pretty provocative to patients, so we don't always realize that we're doing it. I walk around with my arms folded half the time just because that feels like a comfortable position to me. But that can be a little bit abrasive and confrontational to patients. We may want to avoid excessive eye contact because that could also be a little bit aggressive or provocative to patients as well. The individual who is responsible for de-escalating the patient should be the first one, when possible, to establish verbal contact with the patient. You want to orient the patient to where they are, why they're there, in very simple and concise terms. We want to avoid using anything that may increase confusion. I like to say clarity is kindness. This applies in so many aspects of our lives, but it applies here as well, right? So trying to eliminate anything that may be confusing to the patient, because I find that, when we're confused, we're much more likely to be anxious, frustrated, and continue escalating in our behaviors. We want to ask the patient if there's any wants or feelings that they may have, and a lot of this is going to come back to listening closely to what the patient says. We want to listen, and then listen, and then listen some more, right? Because it can be difficult to really get a good grasp of what where the patient's coming from without taking that first step of listening. I find it really helpful after you've done all of your listening to say, okay, let me see if I think I have this right. Okay, what I hear you saying is this. Is that correct? And a lot of times I'm wrong. I use this with my friends and family, and I know them pretty well. We have similar backgrounds, similar interests, and I still miss them. So how much more are we likely to miss the point with our patients when we're not listening and then even trying to explain their feelings or reasoning back to them can be a really helpful way to make sure that we're not missing the point here. When possible, try to agree or agree to disagree with the patient. What I mean by this is I can see how this XYZ situation must have felt really frustrating. It might have made me upset too. That doesn't mean you have to condone or endorse their behavior in the case of JT, but kind of empathizing with the patient. I've certainly been upset in a government office before. The Social Security Administration, I can't imagine how difficult that place is, right? So maybe considering how we can relate with their patient to see what could have been upsetting to them. Again, clarity is kindness. We want to lay down the law and set clear limits on what's going to be acceptable and unacceptable behavior. That way there's no confusion, right? Clarity is kindness. Offer choices and optimism when possible. Are there any needs that you've identified that you can provide a solution to, right? I can't think of anyone who wouldn't be a little bit upset if they've been hungry or thirsty. Maybe you're cold or hot. Are there some needs that we can address and help kind of reduce some of that irritability? And then again, following situations that may have required intervention or situations that didn't require intervention, we want to debrief both the patient and the staff. Why did things happen in the way that they happened, and perhaps getting a game plan for what we might do in the future if things were to escalate again, or if things do escalate for the first time. So kind of keeping everyone, patient included, on the same page. These can be separate sessions, but can be a really helpful tool for us. So environmental considerations. I know a lot of us may not have influence over the environment in the settings in which we work, but maybe I have a few administrators here, or maybe we all sit on plenty of committees. You can put in a word or two on the physical space. And I would imagine that most of us probably work in spaces that are designed to maximize both patient and staff safety. That would be my hope. But this is going to include things like making sure we have plenty of exits and removal of anything that could be used as a weapon. I realize this sounds very obvious, but couldn't go without saying. We want to make it as comfortable as possible in the sensory to our senses as well, so avoiding extreme wall colors, loud music, loud sounds, extreme temperatures, really hot, really cold, can make patients and kind of just escalate things even further when we consider what our environment should look like. Now, I've talked about environment, I've talked about verbal de-escalation and some of the things there, but that's not always enough. And I don't think they invited two pharmacists here to talk about that primarily. So there is a time and a place for medications, but we like to think that that time and place is going to come after verbal techniques have failed. We want to consider what might be the appropriate time to administer these medications, and that can be really hard to achieve, even when we think about it in advance, right? If we're too aggressive and too quick, we're going to hinder our evaluation, both our psychiatric and our medical evaluation, and we may find it more difficult to determine what the underlying etiology is that we're looking for. If we delay it, then we're at an increased risk for the scenario escalating and the patient harming themselves or others. That's certainly not what we want to achieve either. So we kind of have to go back to our goal and what that looks like. We want a calm patient who's able to be assessed. And again, easier said than done, right? If this was easy, then we wouldn't need to be here today. But we do want to consider what can we do, what actions can we take to keep them calm without inducing sleep so that we can ultimately assess the patient and treat the underlying condition. So if we turn back to our patient case, JT, who's been brought into the hospital after running into traffic, hitting another woman. He's endorsing suicidal ideation, responding to internal stimuli, believes there's cameras on the units, violent, yelling racial slurs, pretty typical, right? As you might expect, this is not somebody who has been cooperative in our assessment. So we don't have labs, we don't have a drug screen, we don't have an EKG. So kind of just have what we've pieced together from the police who's brought him in and what we've witnessed. Vitals are stable. We have a little bit of information about his past history, so denies any significant medical history. Carries a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder and polysubstance abuse, although he denies current substance abuse. Maybe we believe him, maybe we don't. Family history is significant in the maternal side for schizophrenia and substance abuse. Paternal history is unknown. And we have some of these really interesting allergies that find their way into the chart that can be kind of vague or difficult to work with. So in the past, patients been on Depakote and been noted to have thrombocytopenia, olanzapine, experienced weight gain, certainly not something that would be unexpected with that medication, right? And risperidone, patient reportedly can't swallow. So we can take that to mean a number of different things, right? We don't know. Mental status exam, patient, again, appears disheveled, malodorous, poor eye contact. He's obviously irritable, angry, and distracted. Denies any hallucinations, though he has been noted, to be responding to internal stimuli. He endorses suicidal ideation. He's clearly aggressive towards others, agitated, paranoid, and guarded. All right, so next steps for JT. I'll give you a couple of moments to kind of think about what we might want to do. If you have somebody sitting next to you, I know most of you are kind of spaced apart, all of our COVID safety. But maybe take a few minutes to think about what you might want to do for this patient, and then I will give you some time to do that. Okay, great break. Anybody have any ideas? There are no wrong answers because I really haven't given you any guidance. But I've heard y'all be loud. Does anybody have any ideas that they'd like to yell out or share? Zydus, okay, yeah, that's a great option. Anyone else? Yeah, IM benzos. Those could be an option as well. So emergency medications. Yeah, those are certainly something that we'd probably turn to in this case, right? They have a role here. We've talked about our patient being agitated. He's already harming others, probably already kind of harmed himself. And so that is kind of where we'd like to go next. I'm going to invite my colleague Kristen up here to talk about some of the evidence and other medications.
All right, thanks so much, Emily. So yeah, you guys got some ideas on what medications you may start to be thinking about for this patient, but I'm going to go ahead and talk through a little bit about how do we choose a medication when treating a patient with acute agitation. So the 4 sections I'm going to go through for this are going to be the etiologic consideration, so what is causing the patient's agitation, the efficacy data, the formulation properties of the medications, and then also the safety considerations that we should take into consideration when making a choice. So first, I'm going to go ahead and discuss how we choose an agent based on what we think is potentially causing the agitation. Like Emily discussed, the beta guidelines came out in 2012, and this was a work group that came together to look at the evidence available at the time to basically get together a set of guidelines to state which medications to give based on the indication of the agitation. They essentially broke the causes of agitation into 4 different subsets. They discussed patients who are agitated potentially from a delirium state, patients who are agitated due to intoxication, patients who are experiencing psychosis with a known psychotic disorder, and then we also have many patients that are that fall under this undifferentiated or a complex presentation. Like Emily talked about, obviously we would want to use methods of non-pharmacologic agents prior to going to medications as an option, but once we've determined that a medication needs to be administered for these patients, these guidelines are a lot of times what providers turn to make the decision. So if a patient is expected to potentially be delirious, the first thing is to assess if the delirium is secondary to potential alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, or if this is not suspected. If it is not suspected, then it's very important to identify what medical concern could be potentially causing this, or if another medication could potentially be contributing to the patient's delirium, and correct that. Most of these patients are going to be on a medical floor, so if there is anybody that practices in like a consult liaison setting, this would be very important to note. They recommended to avoid benzodiazepines in this patient population. Benzodiazepines have been found to worsen delirium in patients that are not currently withdrawing from alcohol or benzos, and thus should not be utilized in most patients experiencing delirium that are not secondary to that cause. They recommend an oral second-generation antipsychotic, specifically risperidone or olanzapine as a first-line option, and then haloperidol orally as a second-line option. If a patient's unable, and you're going to see this time and time again, we always offer oral medications first, and then if a patient is unable or unwilling to take an oral medication, we offer a parenteral option, IM or IV. So a parenteral second-generation antipsychotic, specifically olanzapine or ziprasidone, would be recommended if the parenteral administration is required, and then a parenteral first-generation antipsychotic, specifically haloperidol, would be recommended as a last-line option. Now, going to the patients that are potentially experiencing agitation secondary to delirium and that are suspected to be withdrawing from alcohol or benzodiazepines, it's pretty much the opposite. So we would want to avoid antipsychotics. The reason for this is that patients are at increased risk for seizures in this state, and thus antipsychotics may decrease the seizure threshold and increase risk of causing a seizure in this patient population. So benzodiazepines are the meds of choice. Specifically, we would want to offer oral benzodiazepines first, and they don't necessarily give preference over lorazepam, chlordiazepoxide, or diazepam when offering an oral agent. But when using a parenteral agent, they prefer lorazepam as the option of choice if given an IM or IV. Moving on to patients who are intoxicated. So this is probably a lot more of the patients that we're going to see in the psychiatric setting, especially in the psychiatric emergency room or the regular emergency room. But a patient that comes in acutely agitated due to intoxication. The first thing they recommend is to assess if the intoxication is on a CNS stimulant like methamphetamine, cocaine, or a CNS depressant like alcohol. So if a patient is intoxicated on a CNS stimulant, we would want to utilize an oral or parenteral benzodiazepine. The reason for this is that patients are at risk for seizures as well as QT prolongation when intoxicated on a stimulant, and thus we would not want to increase that risk by giving an antipsychotic. So same kind of recommendations for withdrawal of a benzo or alcohol is the same way we would treat a CNS stimulant intoxicated patient. Now, if the patient is intoxicated on a CNS depressant like alcohol, now we know that we treat alcohol withdrawal with a benzodiazepine, but while a patient is acutely intoxicated on alcohol and if they're agitated, we would not want to use a benzodiazepine due to increasing risk of respiratory depression. So while they're acutely intoxicated and agitated and requiring emergency medications, oral haloperidol or parenteral, if unable to take oral, would be the recommendation. Moving on to patients that are experiencing psychosis and they are known to have a baseline psychotic disorder. The Beta Guideline treatment team recommended that an oral second-generation antipsychotic, specifically risperidone or olanzapine, is recommended, with haloperidol being the next option, and then going on to parenteral options like olanzapine, ziprasidone, or haloperidol. I'm going to talk specifically about this subset of patient populations in the evidence because this also tends to be a difficult patient population to treat, and kind of get into why we utilize these agents and how to utilize them best. Lastly, we have our undifferentiated or complex patients. And essentially the way that they differentiate treating these patients is identifying if psychosis is evident. In patients where psychosis is not evident, we would want to treat it the same way we would want to treat withdrawal and use an oral benzo or a parenteral benzodiazepine in this patient situation. Now, if psychosis is evident or suspected, we would want to treat it the same way as a psychotic disorder, a primary psychotic disorder, utilizing a second-generation antipsychotic, a first-generation antipsychotic, and then moving on to our parenteral options. In addition to the beta protocol, I wanted to make sure that you guys also are aware that Texas has their own set of acute agitation guidelines that are very similar, though have been updated recently in April of 2020. Pretty much the same recommendations, but I did want to point out some particular things that I think are of interest and that I'm going to address when I discuss some of the evidence. So particularly in psychotic agitation, so patients that are clearly experiencing psychosis, they recommend that if an initial antipsychotic dose is ineffective, that the addition of a benzodiazepine would be preferred over giving an additional dose of an antipsychotic. They also suggest that a first-generation antipsychotic plus a benzodiazepine is more effective than a first-generation monotherapy treatment option and may allow for a decreased dose of the first-generation antipsychotic. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I think that it's very important that the recommendation on this is from specifically data regarding droperidol and midazolam given together. And so I don't think that this is necessarily something that should be applied with every first generation, but something to take into consideration if a droperidol-midazolam combination seems appropriate. Then finally, they specifically recommend against the concurrent administration of diphenhydramine and haloperidol due to the risk of oversedation. All right, so let's go ahead and revisit our patient case that Emily introduced us to. So again, he's our 38-year-old male who's been aggressive. He kicked a staff member, paranoid, internally preoccupied. Verbal de-escalation is ineffective, and we do not have any labs, drug screening, or EKG. I heard some people saying a benzodiazepine and olanzapine-Zydis as options for treating that patient. Based on what I've presented so far in the beta guidelines in the Texas Health and Human Resources, do you want to go ahead and stick with those options, or do you have any other thoughts? Sure. The medication he's not taking. So you mean like his scheduled medications? Yeah, so that is a great option. So we know that that's potentially one that is helpful for him since he is prescribed them. In this patient case, I guess we're assuming that maybe we don't know what his medications are, but that is if you do know those, and it is something that has an appropriate like onset of action and everything like that, that is something to definitely consider. So I think that that's definitely, you know, if you're able to get that history and find that information out, I think that that's really good to consider. Any other thoughts regarding if you would consider still the olanzapine or the Ativan or benzodiazepine, or if you would switch it up at all? Sticking with Zydis? Is that what I heard? Yep. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I purposely also made this case pretty ambiguous because I think that it falls under the likely he has a substance use disorder. We don't know if he's been using substances. He has a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. So we don't know if it's if he is just having an acute exacerbation of his psychotic issues, or what else is potentially playing along. So I think that there is not necessarily one good answer, but I think that, the ones that you guys have proposed are all good options. So we have looked at looking at the cause of agitation and finding a medication based on that. The next section, I'm going to go ahead and look at the specific data behind these agents. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and focus on the subset of patients that are experiencing agitation in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, so patients that have a primary psychotic disorder. Most of these studies also included patients with a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. The first study I'm going to talk about is the Paris and colleagues study that was completed last year. And essentially this was a meta-analysis that looked at 10 different studies and included 1,900 patients. And it looked basically at our second generation antipsychotics that are known to sometimes be utilized in psychiatric emergencies, and as well as haloperidol, which is our many times what people consider our conventional or standard of care for acute agitation. And they did find that all of these agents were effective 2 hours after administration, but they did note that olanzapine was more effective and superior to olanzapine aripiprazole IM. Thus, this kind of further confirms that the reasoning why aripiprazole was not included in the beta guidelines, that's probably a good option given the evidence that we have on this agent. Next, we have the Wright and colleagues study, and this was completed in 2001. It was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial that looked at 285 patients, and it looked at olanzapine 10 milligrams IM, and their goal was to compare IM olanzapine to the standard of care, looking at the PANS, the positive and negative symptom scale, at specifically the agitated behavioral scale and the agitated calmness evaluation scale. And they compared that to haloperidol 10 milligram IM, and they found that olanzapine 10 milligrams IM was superior at decreasing agitation at the 15, 30, and 45-minute mark post-injection. And they also found that the haloperidol group did have an increased incidence of dystonia and EPS. So essentially the conclusions of the study that was that olanzapine was superior in its efficacy and had less risk of side effects when administered in this patient population. And then lastly, this was a study that was completed in 2004, and it was actually a European study. It was a multi-center, open-label, active control trial of 226 patients. And the goal of this study was to kind of compare an oral option. So are we going to get as fast and as effective as a response than patients that receive an IM of our kind of standard of care conventional approach that was commonly utilized. So they looked at oral risperidol plus lorazepam, and they found that it was non-inferior to patients who received first-generation antipsychotic plus or minus lorazepam. And they found that the patients who received risperidol had a lower incidence of EPS. Next, we have the Cuomo and colleagues study that was also completed this past year in 2021. It was a naturalistic, retrospective, and observational study of 94 patients. I thought that this one is really important to include because, and kind of what I was hoping is that someone would have maybe said Thorazine in the patient case, because we do still at my facility have many providers that unfortunately go to Thorazine as a first option in a very agitated, aggressive patient. And so I kind of wanted to point out why that isn't a good first-line option and why the evidence points to. This is only one study, but it was the most recent study, so I felt like this was something to point out to everyone. So they looked at Thorazine 25 to 50 milligrams IM, and they did find that it did significantly reduce the clinical global impression severity scale when it was administered, but they did note that about 46% of patients required more than one dose in the 24-hour period. So while they did maybe treat the agitation within the short amount of time, they weren't able to then assess and de-escalate the situation after and utilize appropriate techniques, likely due to their inability to truly interact with the patient, going on to the side effects of that. So many patients reported pretty significant sedation with the Thorazine, up to 80% in this study. 17% said that their side effects were only mild, while 32% said moderate, and 7.5% said that they had severe. Additionally, other common side effects were hypotension and QT prolongation or tachycardia that were associated with the administration. Thus, you can see the incidence of side effects with this is relatively high compared to some of our other agents. And while it was effective in decreasing the clinical global impression severity scale, it did end up requiring more than one dose of the medication for treating the agitation. Next is the COCAR study from 2016. This was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and it ended up including 6 studies of 733 patients. This study, I think, is probably going to be of big interest to many providers that have maybe some interest in some of the discussions that have been kind of coming up more recently about droperidol. This study specifically looked at comparing droperidol to the standard and non-standard treatments of agitation and kind of where it fell in its efficacy. I'm going to talk more about its safety in later slides, but I think that it's important to recognize where it falls in its efficacy spectrum. So they found that droperidol was more efficacious than haloperidol in decreasing the need of additional medication at 60 minutes after administration. They found that midazolam was more effective than droperidol in tranquilizing a patient by 30 minutes. They found that droperidol was as effective as olanzapine in inducing tranquilization by 30 minutes. However, they found that droperidol, it required less additional medication at the 60-minute mark than olanzapine. So fewer patients required additional doses of an antipsychotic for agitation when given droperidol compared to olanzapine. They also noted that there was no significant increased risk of cardiovascular or respiratory side effects in droperidol groups when they evaluated the literature. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about droperidol in coming slides, but I think that it's important to kind of recognize where the current literature stands as far as its efficacy. The last study I wanted to include that was in the patients with a primary psychotic disorder is the Pratt and colleagues study from 2014. The reason I included this study was because there has been some discussions, especially at my facility, but I've heard other people talking about the utilization of asenapine in treating acute agitation. So unfortunately, there really aren't any trials that look at asenapine head-to-head to another antipsychotic, but I wanted to include what evidence we do have for it. And this was a single dose randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of 120 patients that found that asenapine was more effective than placebo in reducing the PANSS excitatory scale. And they also note that they felt that the effect size was comparable to prior studies that utilized and looked at intramuscular antipsychotics. Again, there is no head-to-head trials, so we can't definitively confirm that it would be as effective, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that evidence in case that this is something that you've been considering in your practice. Moving on to assessing agitation and personality disorders. This is a really hard one to address because many times the patients who are agitated with personality disorders, there's a lot of factors that are contributing to their agitation, and so it's really not a black and white answer, and why there also isn't really any guidelines out there of how to address it. Again, going back to the etiology, we would go ahead and probably fit them under a complex or a complex case, and we would try to assess if psychosis is evident or not evident, and if it is evident, we would consider an antipsychotic, and not evident, a benzodiazepine. So as far as thinking about an antipsychotic, I wanted to go ahead and look at the antipsychotics that do have potential evidence, and I'm going to let you know that it is pretty minimal. So the first one is the Damson colleagues study of 2000 that was completed in 2007. It's an open-label study of patients with borderline personality disorder experiencing severe agitation in the emergency department, and it only included 25 patients. They did go ahead and utilize olanzapine IM in the study, and they did find that there was a significant reduction in agitation at the 2-hour endpoint. However, 4 of these patients did require a second dose of IM olanzapine, stating that it's not effective within the 2-hour time frame for every single patient. And then next, the Patrizi and colleagues study. This was a retrospective chart review of patients with any personality disorder being their primary psychiatric diagnosis. So it included borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and then several people had a diagnosis of personality disorder not otherwise specified. And they actually looked at loxapine inhaled in the inhalation loxapine administration, and they found that there was a significant reduction in the PANSS excitatory scale. They did, however, note that 3 patients needed an additional medication of benzodiazepine due to lack of improvement. And they also noted that 1 patient did experience respiratory distress, but it was controlled by a conventional bronchodilator. I'm going to talk a little bit more about loxapine in future slides, but this was a specific patient population that it's been studied in that's kind of a little unique. So I thought that I would include that for you guys. Unfortunately, there's also some disease states that commonly have agitation associated with them that do not have great evidence or really much guidance as to how to approach it. And those 2 would specifically be traumatic brain injury and intellectual disabilities. There's no consensus on the most efficacious or safest strategy provided in the guidelines for either one of these conditions. However, for TBI, there is some recommendations that avoiding antipsychotics should be considered due to potential harm in these patients. And then for patients with intellectual disabilities, to use caution when using benzodiazepines due to increased risk of paradoxical inhibition. The guidelines for agitation for both of these disease states focus on the maintenance medications for prevention of aggression and agitation, which obviously we want to focus on all of our patients, but there's an extra emphasis on this given the lack of evidence for emergency treatments when patients do get agitated. Moving on to an emergency room setting, I think that it's important as patients as providers in psychiatry that we are aware of all the data, and ketamine is also something that has been utilized in the emergency department more and more frequently. So I just also wanted to make sure everyone was aware of this data. The first study is the Cole and colleagues study from 2016, and it looked at ketamine at a dose of 5 milligrams per kilogram versus haloperidol 10 milligrams IM. And it looked at 146 patients, and they did find that ketamine was a very fast way to sedate a patient. And like Emily said, sedation is not our goal of therapy, but sometimes in the emergency room, that is where they turn to. And so while it is not necessarily in psychiatry where we would want to go for our treatment of patients, there may be a place, especially in a patient who has maybe received a lot of emergency antipsychotics, may be at risk for some QTC prolongation, seizures, rhabdo, different things like that, where we may eventually decide that sedation is where we need to go for them. And that is maybe where we would consider ketamine, but this would need to be in a setting where intubation would be readily available for a patient. Additionally, they did note that there was significant increased risk in complications in the patients that did receive the ketamine, specifically hypersalivation, vomiting, and laryngospasms, and that there was an increased grade of intubation needed. And you can see there was a pretty high rate, 39% versus 4%, with this dose of ketamine. Now, another study was looking at ketamine, and this was actually at a 4 milligram per kilogram dose, so a lower dose, versus haloperidol and lorazepam given either IM or IV. And this study included 93 patients. They did show that ketamine was statistically superior at inducing sedation at the 5 and 15-minute dose mark. Again, sedation being the key word there. So we're using this at a point where we feel like continuing to give antipsychotics or benzodiazepine would no longer be safe for our patient. They did find that there was a significant increased risk of tachycardia and hypertension in the ketamine group. However, they did not note this increased risk for need for intubation in this subset, so the lower dose was effective and maybe less likely to require intubation. Next, loxapine inhalation is something that I think everyone should be aware of. Now, I'm going to talk about why we don't commonly use it. There is some roadblocks to utilizing this medication, but I do feel like there is a potential place in therapy if your institution does have the requirements needed for it. So as far as the evidence for it, there was a recent study completed in 2019 that looked at 406 patients in the emergency department that were experiencing agitation, and they assessed patients who received loxapine, ziprasidone, or haloperidol. As far as the results, the patients who received the inhaled loxapine required less rescue benzodiazepines compared to other antipsychotics, and you can see that it's almost half. So there was a pretty significant and robust response to the loxapine compared to other, the ziprasidone and haloperidol patients. Additionally, there was a significant reduction in the patients who received loxapine compared to the other antipsychotics who needed restraints. So only 1.8% of the patients in the loxapine group compared to 19.8% in the other ones that required restraints. And they did not find any significant difference in the side effect profiles when they looked at the 3 medications. Again, I'm going to talk about, you see that there is some pretty good evidence, but I will talk about why kind of the restrictions of utilizing this agent in a future slide. Now, you've probably also been wondering, what about our coveted B52? It's a pretty much standard of care almost everywhere that I've gone. And B52, when I say that, I mean haloperidol 5 milligrams, diphenhydramine 50 milligrams, and lorazepam 2 milligrams, or in the higher dose 10-250 with the haloperidol of 10 milligrams. And I haven't talked about the evidence about that yet. And then it's because there aren't any randomized controlled trials comparing the safety of efficacy of this 3-drug cocktail for agitation. And guidelines actually recommend against utilizing it. The evidence that is available most commonly looks at haloperidol plus or minus lorazepam, or haloperidol plus or minus promethazine, as promethazine is the anticholinergic of choice in a lot of the European studies. Now, what do the guidelines specifically say about this combination? They say that it's likely overkill. However, you also probably remember that in the Texas Health and Human Services guidelines, they specifically recommended against the combination of haloperidol and Benadryl. And you guys are also probably asking, well, we utilize Benadryl to decrease the risk of dystonia and EPS when we give haloperidol, and that is true. The evidence to support that is very strong, that utilizing an anticholinergic medication in addition to a in addition to haloperidol decreases the risk of dystonia and EPS. However, there is not necessarily any guidelines to suggest that we need to be doing this every single time we give a dose of haloperidol, but they don't necessarily say when to do it. My biggest recommendation would be identifying patients who are at high risk. So we know that patients that are male, are younger in age, have a history of dystonic reactions, and use cocaine are at increased risk of dystonic reactions. And those might be the patients where you would utilize it at baseline, the combination of haloperidol and diphenhydramine. Otherwise, utilizing the combination right off the bat is not necessarily recommended and typically leads to oversedation. All right, so I know I just kind of went over the more boring nitty-gritty information, and so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the formulation properties of the medication. So it's very important to know how medications are prepared, how they should be administered, and also how long they're expected to take to start working. I'm not going to get into every single piece of information in this slide, but these are the first generation antipsychotics, and as you can see, for the most part, The onset of action of these medications are at least 30 minutes, if not more. Haloperidol, you may see some patients respond to the IM formulation within 15 minutes, but for the most part, most references cite that at least 30 minutes is the onset of action for first-generation antipsychotics, with the exception of droperidol, which has been found to have an onset of less than 20 minutes, and then the inhaled loxapine, which has an onset within 10 minutes of administration. Some things to keep in mind is that chlorpromazine, when given IM, does have a peak that is 5 times higher than that of the oral tablet of the medication, and thus increased risk of side effects should be of most importance to monitor for when utilizing this medication. Additionally, the IV route should be reserved for surgery patients, patients with tetanus, or severe hiccups only. For haloperidol, the IM IV to PO conversion is 1-to-1, so you don't have to worry about converting it if you know which dose of oral you would like to give. For droperidol, I talked about in the Texas Health and Human Resources discussing that utilizing a combination of first generation plus a benzodiazepine may help lower the risk, and this is specifically with droperidol and midazolam. This combination is also mostly studied and utilized in the emergency departments at this time. And then lastly, for the loxapine inhalation powder. So it's a breath-actuated dispenser, so it has a pretty unique administration. However, it's only available under the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, or REMS program. It's been found that there is risk for bronchospasms, and thus the healthcare facility must be enrolled in the REMS to order and provide the medication due to the boxed warning, and that the facility must have access to on-site intubation and mechanical ventilation. So if your facility does not have access to that, it would not be able to be a facility to utilize this option. I wanted to include this for completeness, but IM syringe compatibility is also something to keep in mind. You might want to use a combination of 2 medications, but if you have to stick the patient twice, that puts both the patient and your employees at risk for potentially harm or getting hurt during the agitated episode. And so choosing agents that are compatible in the same syringe are very important. For the second generation antipsychotics, you can see that actually the onset of action pretty consistently is on the lower end 15 minutes. And so this goes to speak to, and I'm going to show you the data on this, that second generation antipsychotics tend to start acting and are more efficacious at a faster time frame than their first generation antipsychotics. Regarding the pearls for second generation antipsychotics, it should be noted that olanzapine IM to PO conversion is typically thought to be a 1-to-2 conversion. So 10 milligrams of IM olanzapine would be equivalent or close to being equivalent pharmacokinetically to 20 milligrams of oral. The IM formulation also must be reconstituted with water and cannot be co-administered in the same syringe as another medication. The same is true with ziprasidone, that we cannot be mixing it with another medication. And another thing to take into consideration is that ziprasidone takes 10 minutes to fully reconstitute to make sure the medication is dissolved. So if there is a chance that this patient is going to need to utilize it or is willing to take IM ziprasidone and is maybe asking for it, maybe consider that it's going to take 10 minutes and to start getting it ready sooner than later. Lastly, for acenapine, this is a medication that its only route of administration is sublingually, and it is not supposed to be swallowed or chewed. It is potentially a good option for patients who you don't want to use the more invasive route or they have difficulty swallowing. And then lastly, for our benzodiazepines, so lorazepam is the benzodiazepine of choice in many situations and in the guidelines, and the onset of action is between 20 and 30 minutes. Midazolam, you can see, has a little bit faster onset of action of 15 minutes with IM and 5 minutes with IV. Lorazepam tends to be the benzodiazepine of choice because it is the only benzodiazepine with consistent, complete, and rapid IM absorption. And it also is commonly utilized with a first-generation antipsychotic to prevent EPS, specifically akathisia that could be caused by the administration of the antipsychotic. If midazolam is considered, again, typically should be utilized only in the emergency room due to risk of respiratory depression compared to lorazepam. And it should also be used with caution in patients with cirrhosis. Now, I wanted to go ahead and point out the data that specifically looks at which medication works the fastest, because one of the big things is once a patient is agitated and we've decided that they need a medication for their agitation, we are identifying that they're potentially at risk for harming self or others, and so we want a medication that is going to work quickly. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that the oral disintegrating tablets or ODT formulations like Zydus do not have a faster onset of action than the oral formulations. They just have the benefit of the decreased risk of cheeking medications for the patient, and maybe will be preferred for the patient during the agitated state. Regarding looking and comparing each of the agents for their onset of action, the Zune and colleagues looked at 28 blinded randomized controlled trials that looked at the onset of efficacy of antipsychotics for the treatment of acute agitation and found that droperidol, IM, and IV, and inhaled loxapine consistently had the fastest onset of action, followed by the second generation antipsychotics, specifically olanzapine and ziprasidone, IM. They saw that their onset was typically seen within 15 minutes, and then haloperidol had a delayed onset compared to olanzapine and ziprasidone. They also noted that haloperidol plus or minus lorazepam had an onset between 30 and 60 minutes, and that the combination did not lead to a faster onset. All right, the last section I want to go ahead and get into is our safety considerations. So Thorazine, again, is not one of our recommended agents, not because it is ineffective. I did show that there is some efficacy data while second doses are potentially needed in a decent amount of patients. However, the reason why it's commonly not recommended first line is due to its side effect profile. It has a pretty high risk of hypotension, which is increased with IV and IM administration. And it's recommended that patients lie down for 30 minutes after a dose is given. Additionally, it has pretty significant anticholinergic side effects and QT prolongation associated with its use. For haloperidol, we're aware that there is some QT prolongation, though if utilizing a dose that's in the recommended dosing range and that PO or IM formulation, the risk in a patient that does not have other risks of QT prolongations is not seem to be overly high. The risk is definitely increased with IV administration. And then we're also aware that EPS is relatively high risk in haloperidol, and diphenhydramine, PO or IM, may be given as a prophylaxis, especially in patients that are high risk for it. Again, should not, based on the guidelines, should not be a first-line practice in every single patient. And then benztropine 1 to 2 milligrams is also an option as well. Moving on to droperidol. Droperidol has a pretty similar risk of EPS compared to haloperidol. And the QT prolongation is something I'm going to touch in the next slide. And then loxapine, like I already alluded to, given the black box warning of this medication, bronchospasm is the biggest thing to look out for. EPS is also something to consider given that it is a first-generation antipsychotic. All right, so taking a quick look of droperidol, what's the deal? So we know some of us in the audience may remember when droperidol was kind of the standard of care for acute agitation. It was approved by the FDA in the 1970s as an antiemetic and a tranquilizing agent. In between the 1970s and the early 2000s, it pretty much was a very common medication utilized for acute agitation, nausea, vomiting, and for irretractable headaches. However, in 2001, the FDA issued a black box warning for cardiovascular concerns, specifically QT prolongation and torsades. So between 2001 and 2013, the utilization of droperidol decreased by so much that manufacturers didn't find the utility in manufacturing it as readily, and it became almost impossible to get for even providers that wanted to utilize it. So by 2013, it was effectively unavailable to most hospitals. However, in 2019, one of the U.S. manufacturers actually started manufacturing it again and resumed its production, and that's kind of when we've started to start hearing people talk about it again. So is it safe? Should we utilize it? I just talked about that the FDA issued this black box warning in 2001. So the Cole and colleagues study in 2020 was completed, and it looked at it was a retrospective observational cohort in patients who received droperidol in the emergency department for any indication. It was completed over 4 years, and it looked at 16,546 patients. The patients that we're probably most interested in knowing about are the patients who are non-critically ill patients and patients who had at least one EKG done. So there was about 2,500 patients in that category. Unfortunately, only 170 of those patients had an EKG that was done before and after the administration of droperidol. But in those 170 patients, they did not see any significant change in QTC. To give you an idea, the mean QTC before administration was 424, and the mean QTC after was 427. And that was not found to be statistically significant. They also noted out of all 16,546 patients, there was only one instance of torsades. In that patient, they noted that they were high risk for QT prolongation at baseline. They had several risk factors, and they were already on continuous EKG monitoring, and they were successfully defibrillated and survived. Thus, from this study, the authors concluded that they felt that the black box warning for droperidol's cardiovascular concerns is overstated. Again, it still carries that black box warning, and there has been several attempts to have the FDA remove it from different organizations. However, it has not been accepted, and it remains on the medication. All right, so lastly, the side effect profiles of the second generation antipsychotics. Olanzapine, concomitant use with benzodiazepines is not recommended due to increased risk of cardiorespiratory depression, which is higher with parenteral formulations. And if a benzodiazepine is needed in a patient that has gotten olanzapine, it's recommended to separate its administration by at least 1 to 2 hours. For risperidone, it is considered to be highest risk for EPS of the second generation antipsychotics, and patients should be monitored for orthostatic hypotension. Ziprasidone is the agent that probably has the highest risk of QTC prolongation in the second generation antipsychotics, and in some sources states that there possibly exceeds the risk of haloperidol. And in patients that are given acenapine, the risk of akathisia is thought to be between 4 and 15%. All right, so I know it's been a second since we talked about JT, but let's go ahead and revisit the case one more time. He's our patient with schizoaffective disorder and polysubstance abuse. We don't know if he's been using substances, but he has that history. He received the following emergency medications for his aggressive behavior. At 1:45 p.m., he got a dose of haloperidol plus diphenhydramine, and then at 3:10 p.m., he got a dose of lorazepam 2 milligrams. It's now 4:30 p.m., and the patient is aggressively posturing towards staff and spit on a patient. What medications would you consider giving? More Ativan, okay. He just got 5 milligrams of Haldol with 50 milligrams of Benadryl, and that was approximately 3 hours, a little less than 3 hours ago. More Haldol, okay. More lorazepam. So I think that these are all great options. I think that Again, we don't know if this patient is acutely intoxicated, but they are experiencing psychosis. So if we're going to go with that undifferentiated or complex patient, an antipsychotic would be what would be recommended if we believe that they're experiencing psychosis as part of their agitation. Again, if we were pretty sure they were intoxicated on a CNS stimulant, however, we would want to go with the lorazepam. So this would be an instance that it's definitely not cut and dry. The evidence would be if he's willing to take an oral option. The Zydus that we discussed at the beginning would be the first line option. He has not received that yet. And if we're going the antipsychotic route, that would be probably where I would go if he's willing, and then IM olanzapine would be my next one. So yeah, it's been, so it's 3:30, so it's been about an hour and 20 minutes. So, and it was PO, so the risk is increased with IM administration, as well as the recommendations is 1 to 2 hours. So we are past that 1 hour mark. I would, if ideally we would want to go ahead and get vitals if we can before the administration of olanzapine, but we are past, or at least a decent amount from that Ativan, that I would feel comfortable if we didn't think the patient was hypotensive. But yes, this is definitely not a cut and dry case. I'm glad no one said to give him a 5 or 10-250. I'm glad no one said give him Thorazine. But it is definitely some things to take into consideration when you're assessing the evidence and safety. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Emily to conclude the presentation and discuss some of our special patient populations that may require agitation treatment.
All right, so I'm going to take us home with a couple of special populations that we encounter in our practices that may raise more questions, and you may still leave with more questions than answers in these populations because they can still be pretty hard to treat, hard to get good evidence on. But we'll look at our elderly patients, pregnant patients, as well as our adolescent populations. So when we look at our elderly patients, if the only thing you take away from this portion is start with a low dose, get low. You want to reduce the dose of whatever agent we're looking at. We can still apply a lot of those same principles that Kristen presented in terms of beta guidelines, looking at etiology. But if nothing else, we know our elderly populations aren't going to metabolize those medications as quickly or as well. And so we want to start with a really low dose and titrate slowly as needed, if needed. Again, I have some general rules of thumb. This doesn't mean these medications can't be used, but just something to consider in this population that we might not consider with the general adult population at large. They are more likely to experience worsened movement disorders with first-generation antipsychotics, so they may have less of a role to play in this populations, as well as worsened cognitive impairment with benzodiazepines. When it's appropriate, we might want to turn to our atypical antipsychotics first. I've included a study here by Meehan and colleagues completed in 2002. This is a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that evaluated a total of 272 patients with dementia and an average age of between 75 and 80 years old. And they compared olanzapine 5 milligrams IM, olanzapine 2.5 milligrams IM, Ativan 1 milligram IM, and placebo. And all of these groups performed statistically superior to placebo with no significant differences among the active treatment groups. There was also no increased side effects noted. So in this case, if you're looking, although there wasn't more side effects noted with olanzapine 5 IM, maybe it's just as reasonable to use 2.5 IM in this patient population because they were both found to be efficacious for the treatment of agitation in these patients with dementia. We'll take a moment to look at our patients with pregnancy. Again, really limited literature here. There was an APA consensus panel from 2005 that evaluated, that put forth some recommendations on how we might handle these patients. These are mostly expert consensus guidelines and not going to be hard and fast literature. So their first line recommendations from the panel was a high potency first generation antipsychotic, Haldol. There was no solid consensus on a second line option, but the second most common first line option that was voted on among the panel, I know that's kind of a little bit of confusing language, was a benzodiazepine in this option. In more mild cases, we might consider using Benadryl, either PO or IM, for these patients. And then if they're on an antipsychotic that works for them that has an IM or maybe a rapidly dissolving formulation, that's a great option for these patients as well, right? Because we're going to be decreasing the exposure to additional agents to the fetus. So that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. We don't want to necessarily utilize combination therapy in large, I guess, when we can avoid it, but particularly in this patient population to decrease risk of exposure to the fetus. And then finally, I'll take some time to look at adolescents. So the beta work group that we've been discussing throughout the presentation today actually came out with some guidance for the adolescent population in 2019. And so we'll take a few moments to walk through that. Again, kind of going back to the etiology that the patient, we think the patient is encountering at that moment. So first we'll look at delirium. Again, when possible, we want to avoid benzodiazepines. The panel recommended PO, quetiapine, Risperdal, or clonidine for these patients. If we need to use an IM formulation, we can look at possibly olanzapine or chlorpromazine, and then Haldol would be our IV options if needed. For intoxication or withdrawal, we'll handle these in a similar manner to our adult patients that Kristen walked through, probably just with some dose adjustments based on patient's age and considerations in that as well. For patients who are autistic, really the big thing I want to drive home here is avoiding the IM route whenever possible. That's really going to decrease and be really formative on their interaction with you as a provider, as well as their experience with healthcare down the road. We know that they're more sensitive to sensory experiences, and so administering IM medication against the patient's will is going to be one of our last line options for this patient population in particular. We'll consider extra dosing of the patient's regular standing medication and avoiding benzodiazepines as well due to the risk of disinhibition. The panel recommended PO clonidine, diphenhydramine, and then for antipsychotic options, Risperdal, chlorpromazine, and olanzapine. If they carry a psychiatric diagnosis, for the sake of time, I won't talk through each one of these, but we should recognize that this is probably going to be pretty rare that a patient would carry a psychiatric diagnosis as an adolescent. Now, I recognize with the providers I'm talking to, if those diagnoses do exist, y'all are probably the ones who are going to be seeing them, but this would be pretty atypical, I guess, at large to have that diagnosis in some instances of mania or psychosis. It's not uncommon, or you probably aren't surprised we're going to treat agitated catatonia with lorazepam, anxiety or PTSD. When considered to be the etiology, we might consider lorazepam or clonidine. For ADHD, the panel recommended PO clonidine, diphenhydramine, and Risperdal. We have several options listed there for our ODD or conduct disorder patients, and then again on mania or psychosis, relying pretty heavily on our antipsychotics, but we have a couple of other options as well. And then in the case of unknown etiology, of course we want to treat as appropriate based on what's moderate or severe. But for our more moderate patients, we may be able to handle those with diphenhydramine as well as lorazepam or olanzapine. And then in more severe cases, the panel recommended chlorpromazine, Haldol, and Ativan, or olanzapine. So I know that was a lot of information to jump through really quickly, but I think it probably makes a lot of sense. So in terms of just some of our takeaway points that I hope that you can leave with today, we'll go through some of those really quickly. I hope you took away from my portion at the beginning that early non-pharmacological intervention is key, and that as pharmacists, we're not always here to just jump straight to meds or tell you which medications should be utilized, but we also want to promote some of those other interventions that can be helpful as well. We want to utilize the least invasive route whenever possible. Olanzapine and Risperdal both have PO and ODT options. Acenapine sublingually, and Haldol and chlorpromazine PO are options. Of course, minimizing chlorpromazine whenever possible. Olanzapine and ziprasidone or IM are going to have faster onset of action than haloperidol IM and are just as efficacious. If we need to use a benzodiazepine IM, lorazepam is going to be our benzo of choice, and it's going to have the most favorable pharmacokinetic profile in terms of rapid and complete absorption. We highlighted the role that maybe down the road we'll be seeing more droperidol and midazolam, either IM or IV, when needed for immediate tranquilization in the emergency department setting. And then finally, I hope that you took away that chlorpromazine is not a first-line agent, given some of its risks for hypotension, QTc prolongation, and the anticholinergic side effects that it carries. So since y'all have been so interactive, we were really banking on getting y'all to participate in some questions as well. So here to wrap us up and take us home, we'll test your knowledge and kind of see what you've coming away with. So the first question I have for you here is, per the beta protocol, which is considered first-line treatment for agitation in a patient suspected to have the causation of methamphetamine intoxication, so a CNS stimulant? I heard B. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly right. So we want to avoid our antipsychotics in this case, and midazolam is not going to be our first-line option. It's not included in the beta protocol. Which of the following is true regarding this treatment of agitation? A, droperidol IM has the fastest parental onset of action. B, Haldol IM has faster onset when combined with a benzodiazepine. Or C, ODT formulations have faster onset of action than PO. A, yes. Y'all are great. Y'all have been paying attention. Okay, thirdly, which statement regarding administration of IM ziprasidone is accurate? It can be A, mixed in the same syringe as lorazepam. B, requires 10 minutes to reconstitute and dissolve appropriately. C, must be given with 500 calories of food for absorption. I heard B. Yes, that is correct. And then lastly, a patient with autism spectrum disorder who's currently on risperidone 1 milligram BID is presenting to the ED with self-harm and acute agitation, which would be preferred based on the beta protocol. I went through this pretty quickly. Yeah, it's going to be D. We want to try and utilize and lean on what they're using for maybe their standard their standing meds that they're currently responding to. So when possible, we'll try and utilize those and lean on those. And then we have this one. Which medication should not be utilized as a first-line treatment option for acute agitation given its increased risk for hypotension, QTc prolongation, and anticholinergic side effects? Yes, D. Okay, that's it. So I know we kind of went through a lot of information and we went through it very quickly, but I'll invite Kristen up here. If there's any audience questions, we can take those. I don't know if we have time for those But yeah, thank you guys.